Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be going through all the psychology and sociology that's covered in the Milesdown review sheets. I took the MCAT a couple of years ago and I got 100 percentile, and these sheets were one of the main sources of my studying. And I personally thought that on my exam, there was nothing that was on my exam that wasn't in these sheets. So in this channel, I'm trying to go through all the sheets and create resources for you to be able to review and study for the MCAT as efficiently and as reasonably as possible. So this is the Psych-Soc section. This was personally one of my favorite sections to study for, just because there's a lot of applications of this section in real life. You get to learn a lot about how human behavior works and how people interact with each other and all these different theories of society and psychology and how people behave. And so I think you'll really enjoy studying for this section, and if you think about it from that perspective, hopefully you'll get a more passionate lens through which to review this section. So the first thing is these researchers, and personally I didn't find that you actually had to know the names of these researchers or the theories that they came up with, but I will go through the high yield points that might show up in one form or another in your exam. So this guy, Franz Gall, he came up with this theory of phrenology. Phrenology is this defunct theory that the brain size can tell us about the IQ of a person or how smart they are. Florenz, he tried to come up with a theory about the function of the major parts of the brain, and he used this this technique where he removed parts of the brain to study what their functions were. William James understood functionalism. Functionalism is this theory that there's no such thing as like the internal status of a mental thought. It's all about its function in relationship to your behavior and your environment and things like that. And then John Dewey also came up with this theory of functionalism, and basically he was a huge proponent of the idea that our minds don't passively absorb information, but we actively are using that information in the environment. And so he really was a big proponent of understanding how our minds used information in a functional way in our environment. Paul Broca, he studied different regions in the brain and people who have lesions, that should be an S, or like injuries to certain areas in the brain, and he came up with this area called the Broca's area. Broca's area is very important for when you start med school. It's basically this area of our brain that helps with speech production. And if you ever see somebody who had a stroke, you can find these videos on YouTube, and somebody who had a lesion in Broca's area, they'll have very broken speech, so they'll be able to understand what you're saying and they know that what they want to say, but when they're coming out with speech, they're not able to produce the speech in a fluent pattern like how somebody who wouldn't have a lesion would be able to do. Then we have the speed of an impulse, which is Helmholtz. I'm going to be mispronouncing some names because I don't know how to pronounce the correct version, but basically he was really focused on making psychology into a science. And then we have Sherrington, who came up with synapses. So we'll go into synapses more in nervous system organization, but that's basically the location at which different chemical signals get converted to electrical signals and allow different signals to be sent throughout our brain. And then we have Sigmund Freud, who hopefully you've heard about before. He has a psychoanalytical perspective, and we're going to go more into Sigmund Freud in the future because that is actually one of the big names that you want to know for the MCAT. Okay, now we have nervous system organization. So I'm going to go through images for all of these and try to explain it as well as possible. So here is the images of a neuron. So you can see that there's a cell body over here. There's a cell membrane that's surrounding that cell body. We have these dendrites. Dendrites are responsible for receiving signals from another neuron. And then we have an axon. So this axon is this long segment of the neuron, and it's responsible for the electrical signal that's being sent down. And then we have an axon terminal, and this is where a synapse is. So at the end of the axon terminal, we have that synapse. The axon terminal will release these neurotransmitters, or these chemical signals, that'll go on past the synapse onto the postsynaptic area of the next neuron. So that'll be the dendrites of this neuron over here. So this is the axon terminal, and then this is the dendrites of the next neuron, and this is the synapse, and that's how a chemical signal will go from one neuron to another neuron. We also have oligodendrocytes. Those are in the central nervous system, and we have Schwann cells, which is in the peripheral nervous system. and they're responsible for producing something called myelin. Myelin is basically this this sheath around a axon that helps these signals move faster. And so there's studies that show that a signal that has been, or like an axon that's been myelinated, it'll move the signal like within 0.01 seconds or something ridiculously fast. And without the myelin, it'll move it like, it'll take like 50 seconds or something. It'll move a lot slower. And so this myelin is really important for moving these signals faster. And there's different neurological diseases that you'll learn about in med school and for your MCAT as well, where this myelin is not being produced properly, and things like that. And then we have nodes of Renvier, and nodes of Renvier is basically these little breaks in the myelin, and you can basically the idea is that these signals can jump from a node of Renvier to another node of Renvier. Okay. So that's a neuron. Importantly, it's important to differentiate between sensory interneurons and motor neurons. So motor neurons are efferent. E, I remember, or I guess A, I remember for afferent or affect, like sensory. That's kind of how I remember it. But basically, and then E, I remember for exiting. So basically, sensory are also called afferent. They're receptors, and they tell us about sensations that are happening to us, and those go towards the spinal cord from wherever the signal is being received. So if I press on your skin like this, then the sensory neurons on your skin are going to send that signal to your spinal cord. The motor neurons are basically these efferent neurons that are coming from your brain or your spinal cord, the CNS, and those go to your muscles and glands and tell them what to do and how to act. Then we have these interneurons, which are in between those neurons, and they're mainly in the CNS. And remember, CNS is brain and spinal cord, and wherever there's neurons that are not in the brain and spinal cord, those are called PNS neurons, peripheral nervous system neurons. Okay. Now we have, so yeah, I just went through central, peripheral. It's important to differentiate between somatic and autonomic. So autonomic are anything that you don't think about, but are part of your peripheral nervous system, and somatic is voluntary. So if you're thinking about like muscles in your fingers that you can move, those are somatic efferent neurons. And autonomic are things like your digestive tract that you don't think about, but it's still like there are muscles that are responsible for peristalsis. Then we can differentiate between sympathetic and parasympathetic, and I'm going to show you a diagram to make this easier. Okay, this is a diagram that I used to look at that helped me make sense of these things. But basically, there's the nervous system, and you know that it's either the brain and spinal cord, which is the CNS, or it's the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. It's basically all the other nerves, and that's the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. Now, we know that CNS is brain and spinal cord, so that kind of ends there, but we can keep differentiating the PNS into autonomic, which is things we don't think about, like the heart muscle. You don't think about your heart contracting, you don't think about the smooth muscles, you don't think about your glands, so those are all autonomic. And then somatic is just your voluntary skeletal muscle, so whenever I'm moving something voluntarily, that's part of the somatic nervous system. Then we can differentiate autonomic nervous system into parasympathetic and sympathetic. Sympathetic is active and alert, fight or flight, things like that, where if you're running from a bear, your sympathetic system is going to be activated, whereas parasympathetic is rest and digest. So things like peeing, pooping, just like generally, like whenever you think about something being like more liquidy and just like resting, that's going to be your parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, in this whole page, I think this is probably the most high yield thing, which is neurotransmitters. They're probably going to ask you about at least one or two neurotransmitters on your exam. These are the things that are released by the neurons at the axon terminal and are transmitted on the synapse, and then they go to the dendrite of the next neuron. And they're responsible for telling the neuron like what type of signal do they want to send. Do they want to send an excitatory signal, or do they want to send an inhibitory signal? So different neurotransmitters have different properties. Acetylcholine is usually used by the somatic nervous system to move muscles, and it's also used by the parasympathetic nervous system in the CNS. And in med school, you'll go into acetylcholine and how it's used by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system a lot more in depth. But for now, it's kind of it's good enough to know that it's like this really widely used neurotransmitter in the somatic nervous system, in the parasympathetic, and even in some parts of the sympathetic and the CNS. Okay. Dopamine is maintaining smooth movements and steady posture. So you should know that a very high yield association or disease that involves dopamine is Parkinson's disease, where there's a deficit in the amount of dopamine that somebody has. Another high yield association is something like depression, or a lot of the antidepressive or antipsychotic drugs that people use. So if somebody is using an antipsychotic drug, one of the ways that that's working is by decreasing the amount of dopamine that's in the brain. And one of the side effects, the high yield side effects of a lot of the antipsychotic drugs, is that there can be Parkinsonian features because you're reducing the amount of dopamine available in the brain. Then we have endorphins. That's like the important one. That's like a natural painkiller. So if you're really like moving around and excited, and like you can imagine that there's a lot of endorphins after a long run, you're not going to feel as much pain, especially like if you've been running for like 20 miles and you're like, oh, I actually feel pretty good. That's what's happening. There's epinephrine and norepinephrine, and this is like two of the major neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system. They maintain wakefulness, mediate fight or flight responses. Epinephrine is a hormone, and norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter. And that's just like general tendency. It's not always like that. And then we have GABA. GABA is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is a brain stabilizer, and glycine is very similar to GABA. And if you remember from our biochemistry section, glycine is one of the amino acids as well. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. This is the major excitatory one. So I remember GABA and glycine are inhibitory, and glutamate is excitatory. And then we have serotonin. Serotonin is one of the major high yield drugs that's involved in SSRIs, or antidepressive drugs. And the goal with that is trying to increase the amount of serotonin that's available at the synapse. And they're really responsible for mood, sleep, eating, dreaming, things like that. In people who have depression, generally their serotonin is going to be a little bit decreased. The endocrine system is tied to the nervous system through the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and a few other hormones. So these are the other hormones that are really involved in the endocrine system. So cortisol is the stress hormone that's released by the adrenal cortex. And if you remember from the biology section, the hormone ACTH, that's like one of the hormones that's released by the pituitary gland to increase the amount of cortisol that's released by the adrenal cortex. Then we have testosterone and estrogen. Testosterone and estrogen mediate libido. Testosterone increases aggressive behavior. Both are produced in gonads, and they're released by the adrenal cortex. And then we have epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're released by the adrenal medulla, and they cause physiological changes associated with the sympathetic nervous system. So again, these are also kind of like two of the major neurotransmitters that are associated with the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. I think that you should either rewatch that like little 2-3 minute segment of neurotransmitters, or just make sure that you're reviewing this, because again, this is one of the very high yield points of this page. Next, we're going into brain organization, and I'm going to show you some images to make this easier. So the first thing I just want you to know is the general anatomy of where these things are located, because it's not exactly how you would think. Sometimes people think like forebrain is like this, midbrain is like this, and hindbrain is like that. It's not exactly like that. So the forebrain is all of this area in pink red, and then the midbrain is just this area over here, and then the hindbrain is all of this stuff back here, including the brainstem. All right. Okay, so importantly, the hindbrain includes the cerebellum, which is one of the very important parts of balance. And so you'll see in people who have had chronic alcohol abuse, they'll have damage to their cerebellum, and so they'll be like all wobbly and have wide base gait. You'll have the medulla oblongata, and then you'll have the reticular formation, and I can explain these in greater detail. This is your medulla oblongata over here, and it's basically this area that connects the brain and the spinal cord, and it's responsible for things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, body temperature, and you can, since it's like, because of its location, it's responsible for relaying a lot of that sensory and motor and proprioceptive information between the brain and the rest of that nervous system. And then this is the reticular activating system over here, if you can see it, and just see an image if you can't really see it. But basically it's responsible for a lot of the sleep-wake cycles and responding to the world around us. And then we have the midbrain, which involves the inferior and superior colliculi. So this is an image of the inferior and superior colliculi, and I want you to think that the inferior colliculus is very important for processing auditory information, and superior colliculus is very important for processing visual information, and that's kind of how I think about it. Then we have the forebrain, which you'll remember is this really a big area of the brain. It involves all these important structures that we'll go into soon. Then we have the methods of study of the brain, and on my neurology rotation, EEG was a really big way that we studied the brain, as well as other things like CT scans, MRIs of the brain, and a lot more advanced techniques that are not going to be covered by your MCAT. But EEG is one of the really interesting ways that you can learn more about the electrical signals that are going on throughout your brain. And it's kind of the equivalent of an EKG for your heart, but it's for your brain. Okay, now let's go into the forebrain like I promised. So the first thing we need to talk about is the thalamus. Thalamus is the huge part of your brain that's responsible for receiving and relaying all the sensory information throughout your body. So things like pain, temperature, light touch, vibration, sharp touch, all those things are usually processed by the thalamus. Then we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus has this 4 F's that all med students know but won't say out loud in front of the professor. So these are the 4 F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and the last one, which is the ability to respond to threats, the ability to flee, which is increasing heart rate and blood flow, the ability to feed, and then this is fornication, or the F word, and it's playing a role in sexual behavior and reproduction. And then this hypothalamus is a very important part of that hypophyseal portal that leads to the anterior pituitary that releases a lot of those hormones that are responsible for different things throughout our body. Then we have the basal ganglia, which is responsible for smooth movements and helps with postural stability. So a lot of movement disorders that you learn in med school have lesions to the basal ganglia. Then we have the limbic system. So limbic system, you have the really big one is the amygdala, which is responsible for fear and aggregation, or I should say it's activated when there's fear and aggression. And then we have the hippocampus, which is the big one for emotion and memory. And then we have the cerebral cortex. The cortex is a really, really high yield thing that'll definitely come up at least once on your MCAT. And there's 4 different lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So occipital is pretty easy. It's just vision. And it's closer to the back. Then we have temporal. Temporal is closer to the bottom, and it's responsible for sound, speech, perception, memory, and emotion. Then there's the parietal. Parietal is responsible for touch, pressure, temperature, pain, spatial processing. And then we have frontal, which is executive function, impulse, speech, motor. And then we have the cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres, the left is analytical, language, logic, math is usually dominant, and the right is intuition, creativity, spatial processing. And so if you had to guess which side Broca's area is at, remember it's about language. Which side would you think it is? It would be on the left side, or usually just the dominant side, but that's the left side. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to mention is a way that I remember where the parietal is in relationship to the temporal. So parietal is on top of the temporal, and I remember that because parietal sounds kind of like parent or principal, and that's how I remember that's the one on top. Okay, development. So the next thing we can talk about is neurulation, or a very critical component of development in embryology. And this is the process by which the brain and spinal cord and the neural crest cells basically develop. And so we start out with this undifferentiated ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. This is a gastrulation just happened, and that's how we just formed these 3 layers. We also have this red dot, which is the notochord, and the notochord is going to help us with the process of neurulation, or development of all those neural structures. So what's happening is that notochord is going to send signals to the ectoderm, and it's going to say that we want to start folding. And so the ectoderm starts folding like this, and you can see that right here. So what's happening is these 2 ends of the ectoderm are going to meet up, and because of that, it's going to form a tube, and that tube is called a neural tube. Then we also have neural crest cells that are developing around that neural tube, and because of that, we form neural tube, and we form neural crest cells, and that's the foundation of the central nervous system, which is the neural tube, and neural crest cells, which are the peripheral nervous system. So here we can review those important points. Neural tube becomes the CNS, remember the brain and spinal cord. Neural crest cells, they spread throughout the body and they differentiate into many different tissues. For the purpose of the MCAT, you can think that the neural crest cells, for the most part, gives rise to the peripheral nervous system. And then in babies, we have these primitive reflexes. And I spent a week on the ward for neonate development, and they actually test for all of these reflexes to make sure that the baby is healthy and it's responding appropriately. So the rooting reflex, you basically touch the baby's cheek and you see if it turns its head toward the stimulus. The idea behind the rooting reflex is that you want babies to be able to breastfeed. The Moro reflex is this really cute response that newborns have where you'll basically drop them from a height that's very close to the ground, and you want to see that they'll like extend their hands and move it. And the idea is that if that reflex exists because if a baby ever falls, you want the baby to be able to like hold on to something. And so that's the Moro reflex. The Babinski reflex is something that you test on babies where you touch their feet and you kind of like put your finger on their feet and you're kind of tickling them, and you want to see that their big toe goes upward. That's the Babinski reflex. And people who have neurological damage at old age, like they have myelination issues or they had a stroke or something, you might see the Babinski reflex in an old person, and that's abnormal. But in babies, you want to see the Babinski reflex. The last thing is the grasping reflex, and if you ever put your finger in a baby's hand, you'll see something really cute where they'll always grab onto it. And that's, again, kind of part of that Moro reflex thing where if a baby is falling, you want them to grab onto something. Then you have developmental milestones, and these are things that you kind of have to memorize in med school, and pediatricians have to memorize a lot too. Fortunately, for the purposes of MCAT, you don't really need to learn about all the different developmental milestones, but pediatricians, they'll pay attention to things like if a baby is 1 year old, are they doing the general things like they're walking with assistance on a bed, like they're cruising, things like that. If a 2-year-old, they're going to pay attention to the amount of vocabulary they have, and there's just a ton of things that you have to memorize about developmental milestones once you're in med school and you're on your pediatrics rotation. But fortunately, you just kind of have to have the idea for the MCAT that pediatricians pay attention to developmental milestones for babies, and they pay attention to specifically language skills, they pay attention to social skills and how a baby interacts with its environment, and then they pay attention to gross motor movement and fine motor movement. So fine motor movement is like, for example, if the baby is able to use a fork or a spoon, and gross motor movement is if the baby is able to generally like move its arms or move its legs, things like that. Okay, so I'd say that page that we just got through is probably the most high yield page. This page is the one that has the most biology in it. It's the most scientific page. And then after that, we really get into the hardcore like psychology, sociology, but a lot of these things is how the brain develops, and it's a lot about neurology. So if you're a neurology major, this stuff should come pretty easy to you. But otherwise, this is a lot of new information. It was for me. So we're going to try to go slowly and make sure that everything makes sense for you. The first three concepts are pretty easy. There's sensory receptors, which are sensory nerves that respond to stimuli. Those sensory receptors, they send signals to the ganglia, which is a collection of cell bodies that exist outside the central nervous system. They're in the peripheral nervous system. And then they project onto areas in the brain that can process that sensory input. An example of that is the thalamus, which processes a lot of that sensory input. The absolute threshold is the minimum of the stimulus energy that will activate the sensory system. So for example, if you have really, really light touch on your finger, you might not be able to sense it, but if like you press a little bit more, you might hit that absolute threshold, and then finally you'll be able to sense that pressure. You have the threshold of conscious perception, which is a very similar concept, and it's just how much is it needed to bring into awareness. So you might have some things that you can feel, but you might not be aware of it. Sometimes examples of that is like if you're wearing like some clothes, and you might not be actually aware that that sensation is there, but you're still able to sense it. Difference threshold is the minimum difference in magnitude between the two stimuli before somebody can perceive the difference. So if I have like a little needle and I press it like if I press it a little bit versus I press it a little bit more, you might not be able to tell the difference. But if I press it like a little bit and then I press it a lot, then you'll be able to tell the difference. And that's what difference threshold is talking about. Weber's law is the just noticeable difference for a stimulus, and it's proportional to the magnitude of that stimulus. And then signal detection theory is basically the idea that there's these non-sensory factors like experiences, motives, expectations that all affect the perception of stimuli. That accounts for the response bias. So the way that I always thought about Weber's law was with this example over here. And it's basically how I thought about it is if you're in the gym and you're going to lift a 2 kilogram weight and then you add 0.05 kilograms weight, you're probably not going to notice the difference between when you added that weight, especially if you're like blindfolded. You're probably going to think it's the same amount of weight. But if you kept adding like 0.05 kilogram weights onto your 2 kilogram weight, you'll eventually notice it. And let's say that you'll eventually notice it when this hits like 2.2 kilograms. That's what Weber's law is talking about, is like that just noticeable difference at which you're finally able to notice the change in sensation. This can apply to like sounds, this can apply to weight. Those are the type of stimulus that these usually apply to. And this is what signal detection theory is referring to. I always thought about it in this graph, and I always think about it in terms of that hearing test that you have to do in elementary school, where they give you like headphones and then they play these really quiet sounds, and then you have to press a button or give a thumbs up whenever you hear the sound. And so in signal detection theory, they're basically testing for if you have a hit, which is that you guess correctly or you think correctly that signal is actually there, or if you have a correct reject, which means that you don't think that a non-existent signal is there. But when you have a miss, that means that the signal was there, but you didn't catch it. And then a false alarm is that the signal was not there, but you thought that there was a signal there. And so I always think about signal detection theory in terms of those hearing tests that we had to do in elementary school. And then we mentioned the word response bias. So there's actually a lot of different types of response bias. One is the idea that people just like to say yes to questions. That's an example of response bias. Another one is demand characteristics. So anything that can alert participants to the research's aim. So if I say like one of the side effects for your therapy is a weight gain or something, then like, you know, the patient might think that they're gaining weight when they're not actually, and that's an example of response bias. Social desirability bias, if I'm like looking at people who have chronic pancreatitis and telling them like, I want you to track how much alcohol you're drinking for the next week, then they might like underreport how much alcohol they're actually drinking because they want to be desirable to the researchers, or they don't want to look bad, so they might say they had like 2 or 3 drinks when they actually had like 5 or 7. And then there's all these other types of response bias, but basically it's the idea that you might respond falsely or inaccurately to a question. Next, we have to talk about the parts of an eye. So we have this outside, which is the sclera. Then we have the choroid, which is the next layer. And generally it's like this vascular layer that provides blood flow. Then we have the retina. This is, you know, one of the major parts where that light comes, and then you're able to get photoreceptors that feel that light. Then you have the optic nerve. So optic nerve is cranial nerve 2, and that takes these signals back to the brain. And you have the macula. The macula is going to show up as this like bright red spot on fundoscopy, which is like the exam where you look at the eye and see to see like what's going on behind the eye. You have the ciliary body over here, and then you have the suspensory ligament. The cornea is the very top layer of the front of your eye, and so that's what you're when you're wearing contacts, you put the pupil on, you put the contact on top of the cornea. You have the anterior chamber over here, and then you have the vitreous body over here, and then you have the iris behind that anterior chamber, and you have the lens, which is really helpful with taking that light and then helping to focus it onto the retina. So now let's talk about the function of all these things. So the cornea is responsible for gathering and filtering that incoming light. The iris is responsible for controlling the size of your pupil. And so basically the pupil is that colored part of your eye. It divides the front of the eye into the anterior and posterior chamber, which is what I showed you. And it contains 2 muscles, the dilator and the constrictor pupillae. And you can imagine that the dilator dilates your pupil and the constrictor constricts your pupil. Then we have the lens, and the lens again refracts the incoming light to focus it on the retina. We have the aqueous humor, which is produced by the ciliary body, and it nourishes the eye and gives the eye its shape, and it drains through the canal of Schlemm. And there's some diseases that you'll learn about where there's too much of the aqueous humor that's being produced by the ciliary body, and so it causes a lot of vision issues, a lot of blurry vision for people, especially in older age. Retina. Retina contains rods, cones, and this is actually, I think I did receive 1 or 2 questions on rods and cones I think I received 1 question on my real exam about rods and cones, so I would recommend knowing these things. So rods is detecting light and dark, and they contain rhodopsin. And then cones are responsible for color, and they can be short, medium, or long, and cones are in the fovea, which is part of the macula. And essentially this is the pathway from the retina, which is rods and cones. They go to these things called bipolar cells, which end up in ganglion cells, and then they finally go to that optic nerve. And optic nerve takes it all the way to the occipital lobe for processing. And then we have retinal disparity. Retinal disparity is the space between eyes and allows for binocular vision and depth. So if you have ever tried to look out of one eye, you'll lose that depth of vision that you get from 2 eyes. Horizontal and amacrine cells, that's not too important, but it basically integrates signals from ganglion cells and performs edge sharpening. And then you have support, which is vitreous on the inside, sclera and choroid are on the outside. Finally, you have processing. So you have all this visual information coming from the outside world, and you need to process that. So it can happen through parallel, through magnocellular cells and parvocellular cells. And I won't go too much into this because it's not very high yield. But basically, parallel processing is about color, form, and motion, and then magnocellular cells are looking at motion, parvocellular cells are looking at shape. All right, so the visual pathway is basically all this light is coming to your eye. It ends up in the cranial nerve to the optic nerve. That goes to the optic chiasm. It goes into the optic tracts. Then it goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus. Then it goes to the visual radiations, and then finally it ends up at the visual cortex for processing. And I would actually try to memorize this because this is kind of high yield. So this is the simplest diagram I can find about what's happening. You have eyes over here. The light is coming to these eyes. They go to the optic nerve over here. Then you have the optic chiasm, which is where these cranial nerve two cross, the optic nerves cross. And then you have the lateral geniculate nucleus over here. You have these optic radiations that end up at the primary visual cortex over here, which is in the back. And then based on where there's a lesion, if there's ever any lesions in this pathway, like somebody has brain damage over here, or brain damage over here, or brain damage over here, you can test their vision and see which parts of their vision is blocked out, and based on that you can figure out where did the lesion happen. Okay, next we'll talk about hearing, and I'm just going to go through all of these really quickly, and then I'll show you some diagrams that'll help you consolidate the information. Hearing is not as high yield as vision is, but I would still try to know some of these things. Generally, if they talk about or ask you questions about hearing, the way that they'll ask is things about sometimes the receptors on the inner ear, and they'll ask some biology questions related to how the chemical signals and the electrical signals interact. So I'm going to try to focus on presenting this information in ways that they'll ask you the questions because it'll be easier to memorize things that way. But the outer ear is composed of the pinna or the auricle, the external auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane. Then the middle ear is connected to the nasal cavity by the eustachian tube. And you have these ossicles, which is the malleus, incus, and stapes. And I've never really needed an acronym. It's just they kind of roll off the tongue that way, malleus, incus, and stapes. And those are the main components of the middle ear. Then we have the inner ear, which is the bony labyrinth, and that's filled with this fluid called the perilymph. That's very important to know. Then we have the membranous labyrinth, and the membranous labyrinth consists the cochlea, the utricle, the saccule, and the semicircular canals. And then we have projection areas, which is that once all of this information goes into the cochlear and the vestibular nerve, then that needs to go and project, that sensory information needs to project somewhere in the brain to analyze that sensory input. And so the major ones is the superior olive and the inferior colliculus. Okay, now let's talk about the anatomy of all this. This is my favorite diagram to explain what's going on in the ear. So you have the auricle, which is the very outside, and in people who have ear infections, especially babies or kids, a lot of times you'll be able to figure out that they have an infection based on the fact that they're stretching that auricle. You have this external auditory canal, and then you have the tympanic membrane over here. Then you have the malleus, incus, stapes of the middle ear, right? And stapes is right here. and it attaches to the oval window. Finally, you have the round window and the oval window, and then you have the cochlea over here. You have the eustachian tube over here. You have the semicircular canals, which are over here. And then you have the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve. Next, I just wanted to show you an image of explaining how this information is processed in our brain. If you wanted to tune out, this is not very high yield at all, so don't worry about this stuff. But basically what's happening is you have the cochlear and the vestibular nerve, and that's going past the reticular formation and ends up in the superior olive. It goes up, and then it ends up in the inferior colliculus. And then it can end up at the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is that major place that's processes all the sensory information. And then you'll end up at the auditory cortex. So that's kind of what's going on. So other important things to know is that the utricle and saccule are responsible for linear acceleration, detections, and changes in that. The semicircular canals are responsible for rotational acceleration and balance. And then the superior olive localizes where the sound is coming from, and it's located in the brainstem. And then the inferior colliculus, that's part of our startle reflex. So if you're like sleeping, or if you're laying your head on a desk and somebody like smashes the desk, that's part of your startle reflex. That's the inferior colliculus. And it's also used by both the ears and the eyes in the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is basically something where you can turn your head, but you can keep like looking at the same location. That's what the inferior colliculus helps us with. Once you start med school, one of the things you'll learn about in your neurology block is about how doctors sometimes diagnose brain death as that they look at whether the cranial nerves are intact or not. And one of the things that they'll do is they'll hold the person's head and move it side to side. And if the person's head is not demonstrating that ability to like continuously look forward, but instead is just like looking at the direction at which you're pointing the head, then that's one of the signals that these cranial nerves 5 and 8 might not be working, or whatever cranial nerves they're testing for. So this is the auditory pathway that we talked about: cochlea, vestibulo-cochlear nerve, the medial geniculate nucleus, and auditory cortex. And I would just also know that the vestibulo-cochlear nerve is cranial nerve 8. Okay, next let's talk about some other high yield points. So smell is one of those sensations that's actually not processed by the thalamus. It's actually basically what's happening is that those chemicals or whatever molecules that you're actually smelling, that ends up aerosolized in and comes into your nose, and that is detected by the olfactory chemoreceptors, the olfactory nerve, in the olfactory epithelium. And just know that smell is one of those sensations that is bypassing the thalamus. It's not processed by the thalamus. You have pheromones. Pheromones are the chemicals that are given off by animals and humans that have an effect on social foraging and sexual behavior. Taste is the detection of dissolved compounds by our taste buds, and you have like different tastes that you can have: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami. Somatosensation is the idea that we have like different types of sensations. So it's not just you sense something, but you can sense something's pressure, you can sense vibration, you can sense pain, you can sense temperature. So it's actually more complicated than just one, than just like touch. There's pain, temperature, pressure, vibration. You have the 2-point threshold, which is very similar to what we were talking about before, which is the minimum distance necessary between 2 points of stimulation on the skin so that the 2 points can be felt as 2 different stimulus. You might think this is an obvious point, but actually if you like have a really, really fine needle and you press at a point that's like 0.1 millimeters away from the other point, your body is going to think that that's the same location. And so the 2-point threshold is like, how far do you have to touch the skin for it to think that it's 2 different points? Physiological 0 is the normal temperature at skin at which objects are compared to. And then nociceptors are pain receptors. And then kinesthetic sense is proprioception. This is pretty important object recognition. I'd say just know that top-down processing is different from bottom-up processing. Top-down uses background knowledge as the recognition of object by memories and expectation. You're not paying attention to the little details, but you're instead like using your background knowledge and your theories and your behavior and all the things that you know, and like using that to apply it to this specific thing that you're looking at. Bottom-up processing is that you look at all the details, you add them up, and then you learn more about the whole. And so recognition of objects happens by feature detection, and it's not influenced by background knowledge. And then Gestalt principles, you can think about like somebody who asks you, like, just think about the Gestalt, they're basically asking you to use some of these principles, like proximity, similarity, continuity, closure, to think about something. This is a really nice image to explain the difference between top-down and bottom-up. So bottom-up is, what am I seeing? It's basically taking that information from your senses and assembling it and integrating it to figure out what are you looking at. And then top-up is using models, ideas, expectations to interpret sensory information. Is this something that I've seen before? And then Gestalt Principles, you might have done this in your psych class. I did it in my psych class, and basically it was just a way that, you can figure out how your brain works. So an example of this is law of similarity. So you associate these ones together and you associate these ones together. You actually look at this as two different objects, even though this is just a line. This is like multiple dots. Because of its similarity to each other, you think of them associated with each other. Law of continuity, you think about this as a straight line, even though it's just a collection of dots. And then law of closure, you close objects even when you're not supposed to. Things like that. Law of proximity, you think this is associated with each other and this is associated with each other. So Gestalt is just kind of like a group of principles that explain how our brain processes visual information. Okay, when we're talking about learning, what I want you to think about is if there's something in your environment and you now know how to do something that's a new behavior that you didn't know before, that's basically what learning is. And so you don't want to think about it like the same way you think about studying for the MCAT or something where you're picking up new information. It's more like how your brain is picking up information from its environment. It's like the same thing, but that's kind of how we're applying it for these purposes. Habituation is something that happens if you've volunteered at the ED. I remember I did one of my night shifts in the ED in med school, and I got so habituated to this like beeping noise that just kept going on and off and on and off, and eventually I was able to ignore it. But then dishabituation happens because in that same shift, basically somebody accidentally turned off that noise and then turned it on again. But if there's a second stimulus that intervenes and resensitizes you to the original stimulus, that's what dishabituation is. Another example of that is if like there's now a new beeping noise that starts and stops. Now you're like again habituated to the first beeping noise that happened, or dishabituated to it. So habituation is becoming used to a stimulus. Dishabituation is you are resensitized to it because of a second stimulus. Associative learning is when you pair things together. So that could be like response and behavior. It could be like something and the consequence. So if I like if I get like if somebody like shocks me every time that I do a negative behavior, that's what associative learning is. I paired those together. Another thing is like associative learning could be that that every time I eat some, like, I don't want to say the specific cuisine, but let's say I eat like Italian food or something. This doesn't actually happen, but like let's say I vomit every time I eat Italian food, and then I learn to associate those two things together. That could be associative learning. I love Italian food, so nothing against you if you're Italian. Operant conditioning is that the behavior is changed through consequences, and so reinforcement means I'm going to increase your likelihood of behavior. Punishment means going to decrease it. And then schedule is the schedule of reinforcement can be based on amount of time or the ratio of behavior reward. It can be fixed or variable. And so we're going to go into all of this, but basically the idea behind all of this is that let's say I want to reinforce a good behavior. Like every time you study, I want to give you a thumbs up. I don't actually have to do that every time you study. I could give it like once every 3 times that you study, I give you a thumbs up. That could be like the schedule that I do. It could also be like if you study more than 4 hours, I could give you a thumbs up. So that's what schedule is referring to. And then we have positive response and negative response. Positive response means we're adding something. Negative response means we're removing something. So if I take away your dinner every time that you play more than 2 hours of video game, I am removing something. So that's a negative response, but it's a punishment. So it's a negative punishment. If I hit you every time that you play more than 2 hours of video games, that's a positive punishment. So positive and negative is not like, it's not related to whether it's good or bad. It's related to whether you're adding or removing something. Extinction means that a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced. It goes extinct. So if every time you go to the gym, I used to give you like a bubble bath or something, and then I stopped doing that for 6 months, and you stop going to the gym, then your behavior is now extinct. Shaping is that the idea that when a behavior is closer and closer to the target behavior, it's reinforced. So let's say like I want you to exercise in a better way when you're at the gym, And every time you exercise closer and closer to the way that I want you to, then I give you like a better reward. That's kind of what shaping means. Classic conditioning is with repetition, a neutral stimulus can become conditioned stimulus that produces a conditioned response. And the I guess classical way that happens is that if you know if I think it was Pavlov who had the dogs, and if Pavlov hit the bell every time he gave the dogs, eventually he hit the bell and he didn't give food to the dogs, and the dog would still salivate. And that's what classical conditioning is. Then the hitting the bell is a neutral stimulus for the dog. It doesn't really care whether the bell is being hit, but eventually it becomes a conditioned stimulus because it's been associated with the idea that you're going to get food. And then you have observational learning or modeling, and that's the acquisition of behavior by watching others. And so this happens all the time with human beings, where we'll watch and we'll learn by example. Okay, next we're going to talk about memory. Memory is really important in our brain, and it's a lot of times associated with learning, because in order to have learning, we need to remember past events and figure out what we learned from those events a lot of times. And so memory is the process of coding that memory into our brain is called encoding. And so that can be automatic or it can be effortful. So when you're studying for the MCAT, for example, a lot of that will be effortful. But some memories are just automatic. And semantic encoding is stronger than both acoustic and visual encoding. That's probably not going to be tested for you. But yeah, it could be helpful to remember that. Sensory and short-term memory, so that's transient and based on neurotransmitter activity. And then working memory requires attention, executive function, short-term memory. It requires all those things to manipulate information. So working memory is a lot of times if you're working on a task, and then you remember how to do that task, that's a lot of times goes under the category of working memory. Long-term memory, it requires elaborate rehearsal and is a result of increased neuronal connectivity. Explicit or declarative memory, that's basically accounting for memories that we must consciously recall with focus or effort. And so some of the things that you're going to codify into your long-term memory when studying, a lot of that will be explicit memory. Implicit memory is also called non-declarative memory, and that accounts for the acquired skills, conditioned responses to circumstances, and stimuli. Then we have semantic networks. So semantic networks is storing facts. Concepts are a lot of times linked together based on similar meaning, and we will have certain triggers that associate with those memories. Then importantly, we have retrieval. So retrieval is the idea that we stored that memory, we encoded it into our brain, and now we need to take it out from our brain. And so recognition of info is a lot of times stronger than recall. And that's why on these multiple choice exams, that's just one of the advantages you have, is recognition is easier for our brains to do than just recalling it straight from memory. Retrieval is a lot of times based on priming of these interconnected nodes of our semantic network. So an example of this is if you go to like your 5-year or 10-year high school reunion, retrieval of everybody's names and the memories of your high school experience and things like that, it's a lot easier to do that if you have the priming. So if you see people's faces, if you're in that high school environment, if you're like I don't know, if you drink the same things that you drink as a high school student, those types of things, it's easier to retrieve that information if you're like around those different environmental cues. We have diseases that affect our memory. So a very high yield one for your MCAT is Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is this degenerative brain disorder that's affected by loss of acetylcholine and neurotransmitters. And it causes dementia and memory loss, and a lot of times it affects the hippocampus. Then we have Korsakoff syndrome. That's a lot of times affected in alcoholics. You'll see it a lot in the hospital. And it's memory loss that's caused by thiamine deficiency. I didn't know what thiamine was until I started med school, and it's just vitamin B1. It's one of our vitamins. And if you don't have that vitamin because you're an alcoholic, or you're just extremely malnourished, then you might have thiamine deficiency. And these people, they'll have retrograde amnesia, they'll have anterograde amnesia, so they're unable to remember past events, and they're unable to form new memories of new events that are happening. Another thing that's really interesting is confabulation. And if you ever see this in a patient, what that looks like is that they'll be making up a lot of information. Like if you ask them their name or what street they live on, it's not like they'll just say that they don't know, but they'll also have this like vivid and fake memories that they'll be really convinced are true. And it can be really hard to get a history of somebody who has Korsakoff syndrome because they're just making up so much information that they're really convinced is true. We also have agnosia. Agnosia is the idea that people can lose the ability to recognize objects, people, sounds, and it's a lot of times created by like actual lesions in the brain. You can see a lot of agnosia on the stroke floor of the hospital where people have lesions to parts of the area that prevent them from remembering like even their wives or husbands' name or faces. Then we have interference. So there's retroactive interference and proactive interference. And so retroactive interference is the idea that new memories are going to make you forget old memories, and proactive is that the old memories interfere with learning new memories. So you might have experienced either one of these when studying for the MCAT, but like let's say you're studying like way too much and you study like all the sections at once, you might have like retroactive interference where like the new things you're studying are, you know, quote unquote replacing the old things that you're studying, or you might have proactive interference where you're trying to learn more, but like your brain is already full and it kind of feels like you can't stuff anymore in there. So those are two examples of that. And just to show you like the flow chart, so there's human memory, you have sensory, which is less than a second, you have short-term memory, which includes working memory, which is less than a minute, and then long-term memory, which is lifetime. In long-term memory, we have explicit and implicit. Explicit is our conscious memory, and implicit is our unconscious memory. So explicit memory, it makes sense that it's declarative. It's like facts, events, things that you can declare out loud. Those are explicit memories. And so that includes episodic memory, like events in your life, experiences, birthdays, those types of things. Or it can be semantic memory, like 2 + 2 = 4, the earth is round, things like that. You also have implicit unconscious memory. That includes procedural memory, like skills, tasks, how to ride a bicycle, how to walk on 2 feet, things like that. Okay, let's keep going. So now we have cognition, consciousness, and language. So cognition is very important for just like understanding how our brain works. It gets a lot more complicated, especially if you're doing like a psychology or neurology major, but cognition in general, there's this information processing model, which is how the brain encodes, stores, and retrieves info, and they compare it like a computer. Like there's chips in a computer and you can withdraw information that's stored in those chips. That's the information processing model. Piaget's stages is actually pretty important for your MCAT, so I want to make sure that you know this pretty well. So in Piaget can come up with 4 different stages. The first is sensory motor, then you have pre-operational, then you have concrete operational, and finally you have formal operational. So how you remember this is that the first stage is just sensory motor. You're getting used to like the sensations and the motors, the motor environment of real life. Then you have 3 different types of operational. It makes sense that the first one is pre-operational, and then it kind of makes sense that the second is concrete and the final is formal. So I remember that the final is formal, the first operational is pre-operational. It makes sense that the middle one is concrete. So let's start with sensory motor. Sensory motor is between ages 0 and 2, and it's when the baby is first learning to interact with its environment. It's learning to move its arms, its legs, learning that it can interact with its physical environment. It's learning what different sensations feel like, things like that. Then Piaget says that, or however you pronounce his name, that there's this pre-operational state, which is that the child starts learning that it can represent the world symbolically. So an example of this is the teddy bear, and the baby's thinking that this teddy bear is a friend, and so it's representing that teddy bear as something it's not. Then there's the concrete operational stage, which is that the child is learning the rules of life, like how to converse with other people. That's between 7 and 11 or 7 and 12. And then we have the formal operational stage, which is where the child or the adolescent starts becoming an adult. They start thinking about the future, they start transcending the concrete situation, and so they can start answering questions like, what do you want to be when you grow up, or like, why do you like the subject, things like that, where you're starting to transcend the concrete reality of the physical situation right now, and you're starting to think about the future, and you're starting to understand like where you are in the world. So let's go through that over here. We have sensory motor, which is 0 to 2. Child is manipulating the environment to meet physical needs. Object permanence develops at the end of this stage. So if you've ever played peekaboo with a baby, the reason why this is so entertaining to a baby, and I remember doing this with one of my cousins, and he was just a baby, and he used to love when I did peekaboo. The reason for that is because they haven't developed object permanence, and so if you remove something from their stimulus, then they won't, and like you put it behind a curtain, for example, they won't think that that object still exists behind that curtain. And so when you're doing peekaboo, basically you're like removing the face, and so then they see you again, and they're like, oh wow, that's so cute. And so that's what object permanence is. It starts to end at the end of that first stage. Then we have pre-operational, and that's where pretend play happens, symbolic thinking. They start to learn how to talk. They learn egocentrism, and there's egocentrism and centration. So if you ever talk to like a 5-year-old, they'll think that they're the main character of the world. They'll think like they have all these powers and that they're like the center of the universe. That's like a very core personality trait of these little kids, is that they think the world revolves around them. They're center of the world and all those things. That starts to disappear as you go to these later stages. Concrete operational is that you understand the feelings of others, you have conservation, you start being able to do math. And formal operational is 11 or older. That's where you have abstract thought, problem solving, moral reasoning. You can ask them like, is this right or wrong? And they'll start to understand those things. Okay, next we have problem solving. So there's types of problem solving. There's trial and error. You try things and it doesn't work and you learn from it. Algorithms, which is that you have like the set list of rules. If this works, then do this. If this doesn't work, then do this. There's deductive reasoning, which is that you have a list of rules and you form conclusions based on them. And then there's inductive, which is that you form conclusions from the evidence. So you don't have a list of rules that you have to follow, but you have some evidence and you think that based on that evidence, you can form a conclusion. There's mental set, which is a pattern of approach for a given problem. There's functional fixedness, which is that there's a tendency to use objects only in the way that they're normally utilized. One of the ways that you can try to test for this is you ask somebody like, list all the ways that you can use a brick. I'm not sure if anybody's asked you this, but they asked me this on the first day of one of my classes, and I remember listing like 5 ways, and the person next to me had like 30 different ways you could use a brick, and I just said like, you can use it to build things, you can use it to hit somebody, you can use it to like dig down. I don't know, it was like I had a functional fixed mindset in that case, whereas my friend said like very creative ways. Like he said that in the waterfall you can like put it in a certain configuration and you'll be able to store the water inside the brick, something like that. And so he did not have that mindset. So that's what functional fixedness is referring to. Heuristics is rules of thumb. So when you're studying, you'll definitely form heuristics for your test taking, and good test takers have different heuristics. Like I know for USMLE Step 1, if they ever have an ethics question and they ask, like one of the answer choices is consult the ethics committee, my heuristic is usually that's going to be a wrong answer choice, because they don't want the person in the ethical situation to just defer the ethical scenario to somebody else. They want the person to actually address the ethical situation. So that's kind of like an example of heuristics. There's a couple of examples of heuristics here. So the first is availability heuristic, and that's kind of that when we make our decisions based on how easily similar instances can be imagined. So if it's really easy to pull on available information, then that's an availability heuristic. Representative heuristic is the fact that we make decisions about actions or events based on our standard representation of those events. So here's a good example of the availability heuristic. This is a mental shortcut that you might have, or that everybody has basically, that you're pulling on information that you have available. And so if somebody asks you like, is the world a violent place? Generally, the availability heuristic, you're going to say, yes, the world is a violent place, especially if you've been exposed to the news and you watch it like every week or so, because the things on the news is going to report on violent things happening in the world. And the majority of the things happening in the world, you're not going to have available information about. And so basically, you're going to think the world is a very violent place based on the evidence that you have from the information that is available to you. The representative heuristic is the second one that we were talking about, which is basically the idea that we use cognitive shortcuts and use our judgment of people based on how similar they look to our representation of what we imagine them to be. So an example of this is somebody who's wearing unconventional clothing and they're reading a poetry book, so we're going to call them a poet, even though they're technically more likely to be an accountant than the poet, because they're just more accountants than there are poets. But the representative heuristic is that because they look like our representation of it, that they're more likely to be that thing. And so that's like a error in our judgment. Another example is that we think that getting 7 heads in a row is more likely than getting head, tail, tail, head, tail, head. Even though they're the same probability that this happens and this happens. And that's because our representative heuristic, what we have seen happen is that there's like an equal number of heads and tails over 7 or 8 like coin tosses, right? But technically this scenario is equally as likely as this scenario happening. Okay. Next, we have confirmation bias, which is it's a huge thing you'll see when people are debating about news and politics and all those types of things, is that you have a belief system and you tend to focus on information that confirms your belief system. And then you have Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence, and this is the idea that there's multiple different types of intelligences. It's not just one, but there's linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, visual, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal. So somebody who's really, really good at dancing, then they'll have like really great bodily kinesthetic skills. Somebody who's really good at math and science and law, that'll be a logical, mathematical person. So Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences is that there's not just one theory, there's not just one representation of intelligence, there's multiple. There's 7, in fact. So alertness is the state of being awake and thinking. The EEG shows beta waves when you're alert and concentrating, and alpha waves when awake but tired and eyes are closed. And yeah, you don't really need to know frequency and amplitude, but beta is greater frequency, less amplitude, alpha is synchronous. Again, not too important that you know this, but I'll give you a helpful mnemonic when we go into sleep about beta, alpha, delta, all those things. So don't worry about it for now. And then there's also hypnosis. It's a little bit controversial about whether it's really real or not, but it's like the idea that individuals appear to be in normal control of their faculties, but are in highly suggestible state, and it's used for pain control, psychological therapy, memory enhancement. Again, like the literature shows a little bit controversy about this, like whether it's actually like you're highly suggestible, if this is real or not. And then meditation is the quieting of the mind using for relief and anxiety. And then there's consciousness altering drugs. So some of these you'll see like used in anesthesiology. Some of them are used for like on the streets. Some of them are just helpful for medicine. So depressants, and I will say that these are all like pretty high yield for MCAT purposes, but depressants is alcohol, barbiturates, benzos. They increase GABA, which remember is our main inhibitory neuron, and these are all going to decrease consciousness. Stimulants, amphetamines, cocaine, ecstasy, another one is caffeine, and they're going to increase dopamine, increase norepinephrine, increase serotonin at the synaptic cleft. Then we have opioids. This is like heroin, morphine, opium, oxycodone, hydrocodone. They can cause death by respiratory depression. They also cause decreased pain. So we do use things like oxycodone a lot, especially with cancer patients who have a lot of pain, to decrease the amount of pain. But they do cause respiratory depression. So somebody who's like really heavily using opioids, you have to be like really careful to monitor their respiratory rate and see if they have diminished breathing. Then you have hallucinogens. Hallucinogens are like LSD, and then like ketamine. Those are the two really big ones, and those cause altered perception of what's happening around them. They might cause like time slowing up or speeding up, things like that. Mesolimbic pathway is one of the major ways that drug addiction happens. It involves dopamine. It involves the nucleus accumbens, the medial forebrain bundle, the ventral tegmental area. This will be very important for med school, but don't worry about it too much right now. Just for it to be easier for you to remember, I just wanted to show the mesolimbic pathway. So that's this one right here, the red one, and it goes from here up to here. So that's the mesolimbic pathway. Now we have language. I always thought this was really interesting. So language, there's phonology, which is the sound of speech. Morphology is that there's these building blocks of words, and then there's semantics, which is the actual meaning of words. We have syntax. Syntax is like when do you use comma, when do you use period. It dictates when you use the different words in order. So you use I am, not am I, when you're saying a sentence. Pragmatics is the changes in language delivery depends on context. So the way that I say, if I like ask a question versus if I state a statement, my intonation changes and the context affects like how I say a sentence. So those are all pragmatic things that influence language. Then we have these theories of language development. These are really interesting to think about. Basically what they're really interested in is how do we go from not speaking any words to understanding what words mean and what they symbolize. So like obviously at first we might like point to something and say like that is a cabinet, but without like knowing what we're looking at or what the word cabinet means, then how do we figure out what language refers to? So that's like the theory of language development. That's what it refers to. So nativist is basically language acquisition is an innate thing that we can do, and it's kind of like something that's stored in our brain, that we have this innate ability to pick up language, and the only thing that we as humans really do is give words to language. Like we decide which words refer to what thing. Then there's the learning theory, which is that language acquisition is controlled by operant conditioning and by reinforcement by parents and caregivers. So basically nativist gives a lot more credit to our biology, and learning and behaviorist theory gives a lot more credit to our environment for how and why we speak. And then there's the social interactionist theory, which is that language acquisition is caused by a motivation to communicate and interact with others. So we want to communicate with others, and because of that desire, we are able to pick up language. Okay, now we have Whorfian hypothesis. This is linguistic relativity, which is the idea that the lens by which we view and interpret the world is created by language. When I was studying for the MCAT, one of the things that was really interesting to me, I don't know if this is true or not, but I read like this article that people who live in cold. So this is what I was referring to when I was talking about how language can develop as a result of your environment and social interactions. The Inuit language has multiple different words for the word snow, whereas in English we just have one word for snow. And the reason is because they live in a snowy environment, and so they have words like fallen snow, snow on the ground, sea covered by a layer of ice, and these are all basically different variations of the word snow. So this is Whorfian hypothesis is really interesting. It's the idea of linguistic relativity, and that's basically why I was showing you the Inuit thing, because the lens by which we view and interpret the world is created by language. If you've ever read self-help books, a lot of they actually use this hypothesis, knowingly or unknowingly, to explain that if you have more positive language and positive thoughts, that's going to help you view the world in a more positive way. Broca's area we talked about. Wernicke's area is all about language comprehension. So if you talk to somebody who has a lesion in the Wernicke's area, they're going to be very fluent, but the words that's coming out of their mouth, it's going to be a word salad. It's not going to make sense. So that's the idea. Broca's area, it's like broken speech. Wernicke's area, it's just going to be like a word salad. That's how I remember it. The arcuate fasciculus is the area that connects Broca's and Wernicke's. Then we have aphasia. So Broca's aphasia is obviously the difficulty to produce speech. Wernicke's is lack of comprehension, and conduction is like in that area that connecting the Broca's and Wernicke's, and that means that you can't repeat the words that somebody says. And so on your neurology rotation, when you start med school, you'll actually do all these language tests with your patients who've had a stroke, and you can figure out like where the language deficits are originating from in the patient's brain. Okay, I told you that there's a helpful mnemonic for sleep, and that's BAT-D. I remember bats drink blood, and so the idea here is beta, alpha, theta, delta, and that's going to be helpful for you to remember the order of the brain waves in your sleep. So the stage 1 is light sleep. This is theta waves. This is when you just get to start sleeping. It's very light sleep. Then you have stage 2, which is slightly deeper. You're still having theta waves, but you start to have sleep spindles, K complexes, your heart rate starts to decrease, your respiratory rate starts to decrease, your temperature starts to decrease. And then I think the most important thing here to remember is sleep spindles and K complexes. For some reason, they like to ask you what stage that happens in, and that happens in stage 2. Then there's stage 3 and 4. That's when you have more deep sleep. And so remember, we're following the beta, alpha, theta, delta. So we have theta, then we have delta. So that's where you have slow wave sleep. You have a lot of sleep disorders that occur here. And this is all called non-rapid eye movement sleep. And growth hormone is released during these stages. Then you have REM sleep, and this is like the big one that you've probably heard about. This is where you have rapid eye movement. The mind appears like it's awake on EEG, but the person is asleep. There's eye movements, there's body paralysis, and this is mostly beta waves. This is also where you're dreaming and all those things are happening. Sleep cycle is consisting of all those stages, including REM stage, and that is a 90-minute cycle. Then you have circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms is a 24-hour cycle, and it's regulated by the melatonin that's released. and cortisol is released to promote wakefulness. Dreaming, again, mostly happens during REM sleep. And then the activation synthesis theory, this is pretty important. It's the idea that dreams result from brain activation during REM sleep. And so there's activation in the brainstem. And basically your cortex is trying to synthesize all that information that's coming from the brainstem. Sleep disorders can be characterized as dysomnias or parasomnias. Dysomnias is the difficulties to fall asleep, stay asleep, avoid sleep. So things like insomnia, narcolepsy, sleep apnea. Parasomnias is these abnormal movements or behaviors during sleep, such as night terrors, sleepwalking, things like that. Okay, now we have alertness. So there's selective attention and divided attention. Selective attention is when you pay attention to a particular item when determining if there's additional stimulus in the background that require attention. So the most helpful way that I remembered selective attention for the MCAT was thinking about magicians. And magicians use selective attention to distract us during their tricks. They'll make you think about their right hand by showing you their right hand, and that might block subtle movements of their left hand. And by doing that, they're using selective attention to their advantage. Another example is at parties, and there's the cocktail party effect. And this is the idea that somebody can filter out a conversation that's happening around them and focus only on the conversation that's happening in front of them that they're engaged in. So that's how I think about selective attention. And this is how I remember about divided attention, is the idea that somebody can do multiple things at the same time. And the perfect example of this is a chef. And if you think about one of your parents who's cooking a dish for you, especially like a Thanksgiving meal, they'll be doing like 5 or 6 different tasks at once to make sure that the meal turns out okay. And that's an example of how humans can use divided attention to be able to perform tasks. Okay, one more correction I wanted to make to this document is that this should be alpha waves, not theta waves. And that's a mistake that I made while reading this, as well as probably a mistake in the document. And so this is something that helps me. And so when I was referring to the bats drink blood mnemonic, basically when you're awake, there are beta waves. And then at stage 1, you have alpha waves. Then at stage 2, you have theta waves. And stage 3, you have delta waves. And then REM sleep, you see those beta waves again. And so how I remember this is bats drink blood, which is B, bats, awake, beta waves. Stage 1, bats, the next letter is A, so alpha waves. The next letter is T, so theta waves. And then the next letter, drink, is D, so again, delta waves. And then you have drink blood, so the next letter is B, which is beta waves, so REM sleep. And so that's how I remember it. That's like a minor correction that I'd like to make to this video and to that document. So the next thing we have to talk about is motivational, emotion, and stress. And these are 3 topics that are pretty quick to get through, and so I'm going to get them through them really quickly and hammer down on the really important points. Motivation is the purpose or driving force behind our actions. They can be intrinsic or extrinsic. So if you have extrinsic reasons for studying for the MCAT, for example, that's because you want to get into med school and you want to get a good score that'll impress your friends. And intrinsic motivation for studying for the MCAT is because you're really interested in the content and you're really curious about answering all the questions that you have about biology, psychiatry, chemistry, physics, all those things. Instincts are innate fixed patterns of behavior in response to stimuli. So if you watch a lot of sports, you'll notice that athletes have developed instincts in response to different scenarios that they're caught into, and that's because of all the practice that they've done in being put in these stimuli where they have to respond to those set of circumstances, and then they develop instincts. And so that's what you're watching when you're watching athletes. Instinct theory is the idea that people perform certain behaviors because of evolutionarily performed pre-programmed instincts. And so an example of this is when turtles are going to the sea. That's an example of instinct theory, where even though they've never actually seen anybody else do that, or even though they haven't actually learned how to do that, it's something that's evolutionarily programmed into their psychology. Next, we have arousal. Arousal is the state of being awake and reactive to stimuli. So when you're doing your neuro clerkship in your medical school clerkships, one of the things you'll test for is whether the patient is awake and they're reacting to stimuli, and that's one of the ways that you can test for arousal. Optimal arousal theory is the idea that optimal performance requires optimal arousal. And so if you're too sleepy for your exam, for example, or if your arousal levels are too high, like you're not in the state of focus, then this theory would say that you wouldn't be able to perform optimally. Next is drives. Drives is the internal states of tension that beget particular behaviors focused on goals. So you can have primary drives or secondary drives. And primary drives is related to primary, like something innate into you, which is related to biological processes. And secondary drives are related to things that you've learned. So to give you an example of, so this is a great example of primary versus secondary drives. And you can see that primary drives, as an example, is hunger. When you get hungry, you want to eat. And secondary drives are things that you've learned by conditioning. An example is you're bored, so you want to drive somewhere. Another example of primary or secondary drives. So primary drives are things like biological and survival needs like sleep, food, air, water. A secondary drive would be like the need to make more money. And an infant, for example, wouldn't feel the desire to make any money because they haven't learned the value of money yet. And so that's an example of primary versus secondary drive. Next, we have the drive reduction theory, which is the idea that we have motivation that arises from the desire to eliminate drives, which creates uncomfortable internal states. So here's a good explanation of drive reduction theory. You have this unbalanced equilibrium because you want water. So you'll feel a need, which is the need for water. That'll create a drive, which is the thirst. And then there'll be a drive reducing behavior, which is that you go to the sink and you get a glass of water. And now you've gone back to homeostasis. That's what drive reduction theory is referring to. Next, we have Maslow's hierarchy of need. I'm sure you've heard about this before. It's taught ad nauseum in middle schools and elementary schools. It's the idea that we have these layers of needs. And so the first need is physiological. Then we have safety. Then we have love and belonging. Then we have esteem, self-esteem. And then finally, we have self-actualization. The idea is that you need to, in order to get these higher things like self-actualization and self-esteem, you first need physiological needs met. You then need safety needs met. You then need love and belonging. And so the idea is that you climb up this hierarchy of needs. Then we have self-actualization. Self-actualization is the idea that you've fully realized your talents and potential. And so an example of this is that when you've completed your pre-med and you're volunteering, and then you go to med school, and then you complete all your clerkships, and you finish all your board exams, and then you finish residency, and then you become a specialized doctor in whatever specialty you choose. You'll become self-actualized in your career, which means that you'll fully have realized all the hard work that you put into to your field and your interests. Then there's self-determination theory, which is that you have emphasized three universal needs, which is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so I would just know that for this theory, it's important to have autonomy, which is the ability to make your own choices, competence, which is the idea that you are knowledgeable about your choices and your decisions, and relatedness, which is the interconnectedness and relationships that you have with others. Then we have incentive theory. This is the idea that motivation is the result of rewards and punishments. And so it's kind of like the carrot and the stick. You can this is kind of something that a lot of companies use in order to explain workers' behavior. And so you can imagine that a company would imagine their workers as following an incentive theory. And so if they're able to create the incentives for somebody to work hard, then they'll create a good work environment. And if they create an incentive to avoid punishment, like you won't get fired if you work hard, then they're working based on the incentive theory. Then we have the expectancy value theory, which is the amount of motivation for a task is based on the expectations of success and the value of that success. And so an idea behind this is that a meritocracy is really bought into this expectancy value theory, which is that if somebody can reliably believe that their hard work will pay off in a system, then they're going to pursue that hard work. But if it's kind of like a 50-50 shot about whether your hard work will actually pay off, then people might not want to pursue that success because they're not sure if it's going to come to them. Then we have the opponent's process theory, which is the idea that this is how we explain drug use, or this is one of the theories that explains drug use. And it's the idea that as the drug use increases, the body counteracts its effects, leading to tolerance and uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms. And so the idea is that there's this opponent process. So opponent is like opposition, right? And so the body is counteracting its effects, leading to tolerance and uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms. Let me show you some example that'll help. So this is a great explanation that I found on Reddit for opponent process theory. It's the idea that we can use motivation to explain addictive behaviors. And as time goes on, the second emotional state, which is usually the withdrawal, becomes stronger than that first emotional state. So as an example of somebody who's smoking, feeling high is the first emotional state and the withdrawal is the second emotional state. And when a person smokes, the high is the main takeaway and the withdrawal is weak but is present. But then as time goes on, the withdrawal becomes more overriding, and so the opponent process prevails. And because of that, people are motivated to go back into the addictive behavior. Now we have the house money effect. This is really, all three of these are really interesting to me. So house money effect is the idea that after a prior gain, people become more as open to assuming risk since the money is not treated as one's own. So you can imagine that somebody who's won like millions of dollars from the stock market, because of some lucky bets, for example, they might feel more risky with that money, even though it's the same money as maybe some money that they have saved for 30 years at their job, because that money they feel like is not treated as their own, even though it is their own money. They feel like more risky with that new money. Gambler fallacy is the idea that if something happens more frequently than normal, it'll happen less frequently in the future or vice versa. So a really commonly asked question is, let's say you flip a coin 8 times and every time you get heads. And then somebody asks you, what's the probability that the next time you flip that coin, you're going to get tails? You might think that the probability that you're going to get tails next is going to be higher, but it's actually still going to be the same. It's just like the prior coin flips doesn't affect the next coin flip. And so some people make the mistake thinking that just because you've gotten so many heads in the past, you're going to get more tails in the future, but that's not necessarily true. Then you have prisoner's dilemma, which is the idea that if two people act in their own self-interest, um, um, sorry, let me explain that again. So prisoner's dilemma is the idea that people in different prison rooms are going to act in their own self-interest, but the best outcome is if they had cooperated and worked on their collective interest. And this is a really interesting dilemma. So let me show you an example of this. So this is how prisoner's dilemma is commonly used. And so you have two prisoners, prisoner A and prisoner B, and each prisoner is put into a separate prison room. And then they're given the option you can confess or you can remain silent. And the idea is that the cops are trying to get as much information from these prisoners as possible. And so if they tell these people that if you confess, then you're going to get a better deal. And if your partner confesses, then they're going to get a better deal. And so let's say that prisoner A confesses and prisoner B remains silent. That means that prisoner A gets scot-free, 0 years, and prisoner B has to stay in for 20 years. So their collective result is pretty bad. Like collectively, they get 20 years of prison, but this prisoner A, for confessing, they get 0 years. And so most likely this person is going to confess, right? Because technically this person has two options, remain silent or confess. And if they confess and the other person remains silent, then they're going to get 0 years. But if prisoner B confesses and prisoner A confesses, then they both get 5 years. Now, the other option is that prisoner A remains silent. In that case, prisoner B can confess, which is the worst possible outcome for prisoner A because they get 20 years. Or prisoner B could remain silent, which is the best collective outcome for both of them, because in total, they're only getting 2 years between the two of them. But because prisoner A has such a huge desire to confess, because they're either going to get 5 years or 0 years, they're going to confess. And prisoner B is going to use that same logic, and so prisoner B is also going to confess. And so prisoner's dilemma is kind of explaining the idea that two people could cooperate and get the best possible outcome, but their own individual desire or individual self-interest will prevent them from achieving that best outcome possible. Okay, now let's talk about emotion. Emotion is a state of mind or feeling that is subjectively experienced based on circumstances, mood, relationship. You know what emotions are. Emotions is like sad, happy, angry. Three components of emotion. So there's this idea that we have cognitive, physiologic, and behavioral components of emotion. Cognitive is the subjective feeling. Physiological is like the changes in autonomic nervous system, and behavioral is the facial expressions and body language. So let's say you're really angry at your partner for not doing the dishes. You could have the cognitive aspect, which is that you're like in your head, you have that mental dialogue that like, I hate my partner, they never do the dishes, blah, blah, blah. You could have the physiological response, which is that your face flushes, it's really red, your fists are like bulging. Hopefully, you're not doing all these things, but that's the physiological. And then the behavior is like suddenly you like stand up straighter, you start like using passive aggressive language, your facial expressions, like you're frowning, you're scowling, things like that. Then you have the seven universal emotions, which is happiness, sadness, contempt, surprise, fear, disgust, and anger. So happiness, sadness, anger, that should come naturally. Then you have surprise, that should make sense. You have fear, you have contempt, and then disgust is always the one that I forget, but just know that those are the seven. And then we have three different important theories that you should know. They'll probably test you at least. I remember getting like one or two questions on my exam about these theories, and so I would remember. I think that they like to test James Lange theory the most out of these three. So I'll try to explain this in a helpful way, and I'll try to spend a little bit more time on this because it's a little harder to remember. So I think James Lange is like the simplest and easiest to remember, even though it's not as intuitive as you would think. The idea is that first you have the physiological response, and then that leads to the emotion. And so most people think that if you hear an angry dog barking at you, you feel scared, you feel fear, and then that results in like your heart starting to beat faster. James Lange says that no, actually, it's you get a stimulus, which is the angry dog barking, that results in all of these physiological changes, like your heart rate increasing, and all the fight or flight things, and then that like your mind combines all those physiological responses and then says like I'm scared, and so that's kind of the order of emotions in James Lange theory of emotion. Next, we have the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, which is that you have the stimulus and then you get the emotion and the physiological arousal at the same time. And remember, I told you that thalamus is where all this emotional processing is happening. So that's the Cannon-Bard. It's the idea that it's not that the physiological arousal comes first and then goes to emotion, it's that these things happen at the same time. Finally, we have the, I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's Schachter-Singer theory, which is also called a two-factor theory. And it's the idea that we are going to add a cognitive label to all of this. And so first we have the stimulus, then we have the physiological arousal, like your heart rate starts elevating. And then you have a cognitive label, which is your mind is operating and thinking like, oh, that's a scary dog. And then that results in the fear, that results in the emotion. And so we're adding an extra step, which is the cognitive label. Okay, if that all didn't make sense, I would just review this. But I think that those images always help me to understand which one is which. And it's important to just take a second and realize that a lot of things in the psych-soc section of the MCAT, a lot of it is theories about how humans behave and how different emotions happen and why people behave in the ways that they do and why there's motivation. And so it's not necessary that all of these things have been fully explained by scientists and researchers, but it's just important to know the theories that we've come up with to explain all these different ways that we behave because it's not always clear. And then finally, we'll just mention the limbic system, which is concerned with instincts and mood. And a lot of times, a lot of the like fear that you'll have is originating from the limbic system. Next is stress. So stress is the physiological and cognitive response to challenges or life changes. If you've moved houses, that's a reason for stress. If you're starting a new school, that's a reason for stress. Board exams are a reason for stress. The MCAT is reasons for stress. So any challenges or life changes, those are reasons, those are things that cause physiological and cognitive responses, and that's what we label as stress. Stress appraisal is how we define it. Primary appraisal versus secondary appraisal. So primary appraisal is that we classify a potential stressor as irrelevant, benign, positive, or stressful. So you can imagine that sometimes you're appraising a stress as benign or positive. An example of this is if you're like going to run a half marathon in 1 month, you might have some stress related to that, but that stress might be in a positive way, like okay, I'm going to start running more, I'm going to start exercising more, things like that. It can also be really stressful, like a death of a family member or something like that. It can be irrelevant, so irrelevant might be like an exam that you've already studied for, or I don't know, just like things that are not going to affect you that much. Then we have secondary appraisal, which is evaluating if an organism can cope with the stress. So there's one thing, which is that is the stress good or bad or irrelevant? And then the second one is can you actually handle the stress? And so that's secondary appraisal. And then we have stressors. Stressors is anything that leads to a stress response. And you can have distress or eustress. And remember, eustress is that benign positive type of stress. Um, and so there's this theory of stress. Let me show you. There's this theory of stress that's the idea that you actually have like stress can be actually healthy. It's not always unhealthy. And this is not what, you'll see on social media and stuff, but this is why a lot of people who become really rich really quickly and then they retire, they might be too low on this stress level productivity thing. Like they might be right here. And so then they don't have enough stress where they feel productive and living a good life. And so there is an amount of stress that you want to have in your life to be pushing you towards your goals and to be making you productive and accountable. But then that can go too far and lead to distress, which is where this person is. And there can be a certain number of stressors that can just be too much for somebody to cope with, and that's distress. Then we have the general adaptation syndrome. This is the idea that specific stressors don't have specific responses. They all generate the same general physical stress response. And so that means that it's not like different types of stresses is going to result in different type of responses, but more like we just have a general way of adapting to stress. And those three stages is alarm, resistance, exhaustion. This is actually something that I would remember because I do remember getting questions about this on my practice exams. And so this is involving the sympathetic nervous system. That should make sense. Stress should activate the fight or flight system and the endocrine system, specifically increasing cortisol through the release of ACTH. So this is something you're definitely going to encounter in your studying, which is the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. So you can imagine that there's a stress that happens, and in the immediate term, you're not able to equip with that really well because you're just adjusting to everything. But then you start to have this resistance stage, which is that you have the stress and you're able to cope with it, and you're doing a really good job coping with it. But it could be possible that you have the stress for so long that eventually you reach stage three, which is exhaustion, or as like I like to remember, it's just burnout. And so you could burn out from the amount of stress, and that's what exhaustion refers to. You can imagine like a physician who's working for like so many years and they're really burnt out. So in the beginning, they're doing a really good job. They're just handling the stress, and then eventually, they're just handling, and they're doing a really good job. But eventually, they'll hit a point where they get burnt out, and the stress is too much for them to cope with, or they never were able to develop like a good coping mechanism in the first place, and so they reached the point of exhaustion. Now we're getting into identity and personality. So identity is a really interesting concept. It's not something that we fully understood, but there are some important vocabulary terms that people like to throw around, especially on the MCAT. So I think it would be good for you to know these things. The first thing is self-concept, which is how do you describe yourself? So this is kind of when people in interviews, I remember getting like med school interviews where they would be like, tell me three important qualities about yourself, or tell me like five ways that a friend would describe you. Those are questions that are asking about your self concept. How do you see yourself basically? Then we have identities. Identities is basically the idea of self concept related to the group to which we belong. And so it's how we describe ourselves in relationship to the groups that we belong to. So if somebody asks you about your identity, you'll probably tell them like probably something that'll come up is your job or the school you go to or the major you do, or like the track you're on in life, how old you are, things like that. And so a lot of that is based on your self-concept, like the things that you would describe yourself as well as the groups to which you belong to. Like I'm in my 20s, I'm in this school, I pursue this major, things like that. Then you have self-esteem, which is how close is your actual self to your ideal self. Um, and so the idea here is that if you're really far from who you want to be, then your self-esteem is going to be low. But if you're pretty close to like following the actions that'll lead you to your ideal self, then your self-esteem is going to be really high. And so I remember people saying like my self-esteem is so high because people always compliment me. And I remember thinking like that's not exactly what self-esteem is. It's great that people compliment you and that boost your esteem, but your self-esteem is really like, do you see yourself as your ideal self? Like if you say that you're going to study a lot and be a really hard worker, are you studying a lot and being a hard worker? If so, then your self-esteem is probably high. If you have some certain like personal goals for yourself about being a nice person, and then you find yourself always complimenting other people and just going out of your way to help people, then your self-esteem is probably pretty high. But if you want to be a certain way and then you consistently find yourself doing actions that don't align with that, then your self-esteem might be low. So that's what that's referring to. Self-efficacy is the idea that we see ourselves as people being capable of handling given situations with our given skill set. And so imagine that you're thrown into a situation where you don't really know everything, um, and there's a lot of confusing factors. Do you think that you would be able to handle that situation given your current skill sets and given your current like ability to adapt? And that's what self-efficacy is referring to. So something that's going to come up in med school interviews and eventually residency interviews is they're probably going to ask you questions related to self-efficacy. Do you see yourself as being able to handle situations with which you're uncomfortable or you're put in a depth out of your league, for example? Then we have learned helplessness. And so people who are consistently put into these situations where they're not able to achieve their goals, they'll learn the ability to be helpless. And so that means basically that they don't feel like they have a lot of self-efficacy, and because they consistently try to get out of the environment or to avoid negative stimuli that they're put into, and they're not able to, and so that results in their inability to get out of the situation. So this is kind of a simplification of the idea of learned helplessness. The reason why I'm hammering down on this is because it's probably going to be tested in one way or the other. And it's the idea that these people could just go around the wall and reach their goal over here, but instead they have this learned helplessness barrier, which is that we should wait until they tell us what to do. Otherwise, we might get into trouble. It's the idea that they're like asking for suggestions on what to do. They have this big boulder that's saying no. And so somebody who has a lot of self-efficacy, they would go around this and reach their goals. But learned helplessness is the idea that people learn that they're not capable of going through barriers. Then we have locus of control. This can be internal or external. Internal is that we control our own success and failure, and external are that outside factors have more control. So here's a great image of internal versus external. An internal person will have these thoughts like, look what I can do. I determine my future. I make things happen. Somebody who's external will believe that everything that happens to them is because of other things. Like, why bother? Why does this always happen to me? There's nothing I can do. So internal is that you make things happen. External means that things happen to you. So I once took this class in my last year of undergrad, and this is just an aside, but it's related to locus of control. And we learned about a study in which they took 3 groups of patients. One group got no intervention. One group was put onto this SSRI plus exercise regimen. And then this last group of people were just put in on exercise regimen. And they looked at the happiness of everybody self-reported before and after the interventions. And obviously, the people who had SSRI plus exercise were a lot happier than the people who had not gotten any intervention. And the people who had just done exercise as an intervention were also happier than the people who had gotten no intervention. But interestingly, the people who had just done exercise were slightly happier than the people who had gotten SSRIs and exercise. And the researchers were really confused about that, but eventually they came to the conclusion that the idea there is that there's a locus of control. And so the idea is that the SSRIs were definitely making people happier, but the people who were just doing exercise had more of an internal locus of control, and they believed that they were the reason that they were getting happier because of the effort that they were putting in. And the people who were doing SSRIs and exercise, even though they were doing the exercise, they just believed that all of the happiness that they were getting was just because of the SSRIs. And so the idea that their locus of control felt more external to them made them a little bit less happier than the people who were doing just the exercise. And so that's just one of the ways that locus of control is really interesting in psychology literature. Okay, now let's talk about formation of identity. And there's a lot of different theorists about this. So there's a lot of different people who give explanations of how we form our identity. And a lot of this is related to child psychiatry. And so we're figuring out at what stage do people develop different aspects of their identity and personality, and at what points do they understand different things about life and living. So the first thing is Freud. We learn a lot about Freud and psychology, even though a lot of things we might disagree with now, partly because he's one of the founding figures of a lot of modern day psychology. So he describes like the formation of identity largely based on this psychosexual stage of personality development. He says that we have these different tensions, and tensions are caused by libido or sexual desires, and the failure of your ability to progress at a stage leads to fixation, which is why people develop personality disorders. And so now we know that this is not true, but this is basically his understanding of how people develop, which is that at 0 to 1 we develop our like oral senses. So you can imagine like a baby is learning to breastfeed and all those things. Then 1 to 3 is anal, like reflexes, learning how to use the anus, pooping, all those things. 3 to 6 is phallic, and then 6 to puberty is latent, and then puberty to adult is genital. And so this is basically the stages that he talks about, and he says that at these ages people are developing through these stages, and anytime somebody fails to go past a stage, they get fixated on that stage. And so when they get fixated on that stage, you might see an adult who's still fixated on the phallic stage, and so that's what leads to a personality disorder. Now we have Erikson. This is kind of more consistent with modern day psychology. He says that stages stem from conflicts that happen throughout life, and so this is a lot easier to memorize than this stuff, because this stuff, it kind of makes sense if you think about it. 0 to 1, babies are developing, the idea of a stranger danger, trust versus mistrust. So who can they trust? Who do they not trust? 1 to 3 is when they're learning to navigate through the world. They're learning that they can like move their arms, legs. They have autonomy. And they're also learning shame, like parents are telling them, don't do that, don't think that, don't say that, things like that. And so they're learning autonomy versus shame. Then 3 to 6 is where they're taking initiative, and they're also feeling guilt. And so you can imagine like this is where people start saying like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a ninja, I want to be a soccer player, things like that. 6 to 12 is when there's industry versus inferiority, and so this is where people start going to school, where grades start to matter. You start to see like praising kids based on like their ability to clean up their room. You might like punish a kid for not doing well in school. 12 to 20 is where a lot of the identity actually forms. So you can have identity, or you could have role confusion. People can be confused about what career they want to go into, what they think about themselves, all these different things. 20 to 40 is where you have intimacy versus isolation. It's all about finding a partner, finding like relationships, finding friendships, all those things. 40 to 65 is where you start to think about like money, generativity, stagnation, start to have kids, like focus on the kids, and like focus on your job, things like that. Then 65 to death is where you have integrity versus despair. People start to go into religion, people start to think about death, people start to think about what happens after death, things like that. Kohlberg says that there's moral dilemmas. So instead of conflicts throughout life, there are moral dilemmas that define the stages. So as you see, like as we're going through this, you'll see like all these people are defining life as a series of stages. Freud bases those stages as psychosexual stages. Erikson says that the stages are based on conflicts throughout life, so this versus this. And then Kohlberg is saying that stages are based on moral dilemmas. And so you have 6 stages in 3 different phases. So this is Kohlberg's stages. You have different levels. There's pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And then you have stages of motivation. So in pre-conventional, between 3 and 7 years old, you have avoiding punishments, so obtaining rewards. Then conventional, you have kids want to be accepted, they want to belong, and then they want to obey rules and regulations. And then finally, you have post-conventional, which is where people start to live based on moral imperatives. They start to make and keep promises. They might realize that the law is different from what's ethical or moral. Here's kind of a more detailed description of it. So you see these 6 stages over here. I guess I should say 6 levels. So you have the obedience punishment. This is like infancy. This is where there's no difference between doing what's right and avoiding punishment. You have self-interest. This is where interest starts to relate to rewards and punishments. Then you have conformity, interpersonal accord. This is like good boy, good girl, like you're trying to be approved, you're trying to make maintain familial relationships, friendly relationships with other people. Then you have authority and social order. This is where you start to follow rules, you start to maintain social order, you start to realize that there are rules in society and you start to follow them. And then finally you get to the post-conventional stuff, which is in your teenage and adult years. Teenage years, you have a social contract. You start to realize that people have developed social contracts to develop mutual benefit, reciprocity. You might start to realize that what's morally right might be different from what's legally right. And then you might start to realize that utilitarian rules generally make life better for everybody. Then finally you have universal principles in adulthood, which is the idea that you finally have grasped morality, and that morality is based on principles that might transcend just mutual benefit, utilitarian principles. They might transcend like reciprocity. They might go beyond those things, and you might realize that there are actual moral imperatives that people should follow. Okay, and then we have Vygotsky. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but basically he says that for a child to develop new skills and master new skills, they have to be around other people who are outside their zone of proximal development, and so that they're able to learn those new skills. So that's what Vygotsky is saying. Then we have imitation and role-playing, role-taking, and this is how children learn from other people. So you might see like a child who's imitating or playing doctor, they might be playing lawyer, and so this is a way that they're role-taking, they're imitating. They might be playing like they're a mom or a dad, and so they're learning from other people by acting out that role. This is what the Kohlberg moral dilemmas is referring to, the three phases: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Pre-conventional, I must share this toy because if I don't, I'll get in trouble. Conventional, the law says something, so you have to follow it. And post-conventional, just because the law says it's what you're supposed to do doesn't mean it's always ethical. Okay, next we have personality. So personality is this really complicated thing, and it's basically people's desire to explain why do people act consistently in the way that they act. And so there's a lot of different theorists who have tried to tackle personality, and they're all like pretty interesting and very, very convoluted. They've written, like Jung has written like hundreds of pages on personality, and it's very, very complicated. So we'll just try to simplify this as best as we can and just get through it for the purposes of the MCAT. Okay, so the first thing we'll talk about is personality. It results from urges and desires. That's basically the foundation of psychoanalytic perspective. And so these are all unconscious, that's important to know, and they're unconscious urges or desires that people have, and that influences personality or the way that people behave. Freud's theory is that we have these three things, id, superego, and ego, that tells us our personality. And so id is basically our basic urges of survival, reproduction. Superego is the thing that's telling us what's moral, the idealist, the perfectionist, and ego is the thing that's mediating between the two and the conscious mind. And so how I always remember this is I remember like you have an angel and a devil on your shoulder, and it's telling you what to do, and you're the ego who's trying to figure out what is the thing that I have to do. So the ego is using defense mechanisms to decrease the stress that's produced by the id and superego that's on your two shoulders. And then they all three operate in part to the unconscious. And so you're not always conscious of what the id and the superego is saying, but you are subconsciously mediating those two with your ego. Jung has this belief that there's this collective unconscious that's linking all humans together, and that personality is influenced by archetypes. So this is really interesting. And this is kind of how Jung believes the archetypes are, which is that they're symbolic images that we unconsciously understand. And so examples of this is the ruler, the creator, the sage, the innocent. And so through the stories that we tell ourselves and each other, we form these archetypes that kind of explain human behavior and personality. Then we have Adler and Horney, and they're both psychologists who have described unconscious as being motivated by social urges. So if you look at this is a helpful image. And so this is Karen Horney, who says that childhood anxiety triggers our desire for love and security. And Adler, who says that our inferiority complex triggers us to compensate in other ways. And so they're basically describing what I was talking about before, which is that that unconscious is motivated by the social urges, by our upbringing or how we interact with other people. Next, we have humanistic perspective, which is that we emphasize the internal feeling of healthy individuals as they strive for happiness and self-realization. So examples of the humanist perspective is Rogers and Maslow. And so Rogers kind of describes this humanistic view of humanity, which is that we can have unconditional positive regard for other people. And so that's his humanistic view of personality. And I always think of the humanistic perspective as this overwhelmingly positive perspective on human personality and human behavior. And so one of the things that Carl Rogers really put in the emphasis of his of therapeutic practice in general is this idea that we can radically accept and value somebody completely without judgment and conditions. And this humanistic perspective was really the first time that we were able to incorporate this into client-centered therapy. And so if you see a therapist who has read a lot of Carl Rogers' works, and they might adopt this belief that we should completely accept somebody and support somebody even when they make mistakes or express difficult feelings. And so Rogers kind of came up with that idea of unconditional positive regard. Then we have the type and trait theory, which is the idea that personality can be described by identifiable traits that carry characteristic behaviors. And we have type theories, which is all of these different things like ancient Greek humors, Sheldon's somatotypes, divisions into type A, type B, Myers-Briggs type inventory. And so these are all different ways that we try to categorize people into different types of personalities. We have numerous types of trait theories. And so this is kind of different ways that we describe people's traits. So we have the PEN, which is P for psychotism or nonconformity with normal behavior of the crowd. We have extroversion, which is somebody's sociability. And then we have neuroticism, which is how aroused are people in stressful situations. So somebody's really neurotic, you might notice them like staying up all night before the test. They might be like drinking a lot of coffee or abusing a lot of drugs and things like that because they're very neurotic before an exam. Big five are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I always remember this by remembering ocean for the big five. And then we have the three basic traits. And so the three basic traits describes that we have cardinal traits, which is how people organize their entire lives. Then we have central traits, which is the major characteristics of personality. And then secondary traits, which are the more personal characteristics. It's limited in occurrence. And these are usually the ones that you can like differentiate people on. Now we have the social cognitive perspective, which is that individuals react with their environment in a cycle called reciprocal determinism. So this is the idea that people's personality develops in relationship to the community or the environment, and that people can mold their environments according to their personality, and that the environments in turn shape their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And so if you've ever met somebody who was like a bully in high school, but then in college or like 10 years after they become like really nice, and you like feel like they're totally different, this theory would say that the reason for that is because they've changed their personality in response to the new environment that they're in. Then we have the behaviorist perspective, which is the idea that our personality develops as a result of operant conditioning. Remember, operant conditioning is that one with the rewards and punishments. And so this is kind of a view of personality as that we respond to punishments or rewards, and that's how we form our personality. And so if you see somebody who's really hardworking in a company, the behaviorist perspective would say like they're very hardworking because they're rewarded appropriately for being hardworking and they're punished for not being hardworking. Then we have the biological perspective, which is the idea that behavior can be explained as a result of our genetics and the genetic expression. So obviously all of these different perspectives are true. You do have your personality developing in response to the environment. The behaviorist perspective is also true that, people do respond to rewards and punishments. And the biological perspective is true that part of our personality is determined by genetic expression. But just knowing that these are different perspectives for how our personality develop is very important for the MCAT, because they might tell you that in this article they're describing somebody's view on personality, and then they might ask you a question about which perspective would this most directly align with. And so you would have to know which of these perspectives is most consistent with how somebody would describe personality. Okay. All right, so the next thing we got to talk about is psych disorders. So a really important one for the purposes of medicine and MCAT is schizophrenia. This is associated with positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So if you're on the psych ward and you meet somebody with schizophrenia, something that they'll have is delusions, or they'll have hallucinations. They might think that there's some chip in their head that's watching them, or that the government is installing something into their head. They'll have this delusion that that's happening, and then they might be seeing things or hearing things that you and I don't see. Those are hallucinations. They'll also have negative symptoms. So you might see that somebody with schizophrenia is not properly taking care of their hygiene. They might lose their affect, and they might lose their volition for things. And so if you talk to them, their voice will be really flat, and they might lose their desire to achieve goals and things like that. And so those are things that describe schizophrenia. Then we have depressive disorders. And depressive disorders, you can describe them as major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, seasonal affective disorder. The differences don't matter too much, but it's important to know that depressive disorders include things that you would think about with depression. And so for the purposes of step one, the things that they want you to know about depression is that usually there's sleep disturbances. Somebody loses their interest in doing things. Somebody has guilt about their life, or about things in their life. They'll lose their energy. They'll lose their ability to concentrate on different tasks. They'll have changes in their appetite, like they might be eating a lot more, a lot less. They'll have like psychomotor agitation, so they might talk slower, faster than usual, usually slower than usual, and then they might have suicidal ideation, and those are things that describe major depressive disorder. You can also have like people who don't quite fit their criteria of major depressive disorder, but they've had like almost 2 years or more than 2 years of like dysthymia, like depressive symptoms, and those people have persistent depressive disorders. And then if you know people who get like really moody and sad during the winter months, usually that's described as seasonal affective disorder. Like they might not have depressive symptoms during the summer, but those do come on in the winter times. And then you have bipolar. So bipolar is when you have manic or hypomanic episodes, and bipolar 1 is when you have at least a manic episode. Bipolar 2 is when you have at least one hypomanic episode and at least one major depressive disorder. People with mania, they usually have like distracted. It's like they're always distracted. They're very impulsive. They talk really quickly. They have like a flight of ideas. They might think that they're going to become president, or like an Olympic athlete. Just like generally very energetic. They have trouble sleeping. So those are things that describe manic or hypomanic episodes. Anxiety disorders include general anxiety disorder, phobia, social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, panic disorder. Generally, whenever you see somebody who's really anxious about things, if it's about a lot of things, then it's general anxiety disorder. If it's specific things, like they always need to wash their hands or else they'll have a lot of anxiety, those are specific phobias. They might have social anxiety disorder, like they might have trouble talking to other people because they get really anxious in social situations. Agoraphobia is a type of phobia. And then panic disorder is like when people have these panic attacks that feel like heart attacks. Obsessive compulsive disorder is when somebody has obsessions and compulsions that are related to those obsessions. So I met somebody who had OCD about washing their hands, and so they would have these constant obsessions about like always wanting to feel clean, and they'll feel like really dirty all the time. They'll feel like the devil is on their hands, things like very persistent intrusive thoughts. And then they'll have a compulsion, and the compulsion is things that'll relieve the tension. So they might relieve the thoughts, but it doesn't actually relieve the problem that they're having. So that person, every time they would feel like that, would like wash their hands for like 10 minutes, but it was a repetitive task. It would relieve their tension, but it wasn't like taking care of their actual persistent thought or impulse. Some really extreme examples of OCD is like people who like feel this obsession about like putting a knife into somebody else's back or something like that. Like those are really extreme examples of obsessions. And they'll have a compulsion, like they have to run out of the room or something. Those are compulsions, like something that's not actually going to fix the issue, but like relieves that obsession that they're having. Body dysmorphic disorder is like a lot of people who go to the gym for a long time, they'll have negative evaluations that are unrealistic about their experience. Anybody can have this. So it's like generally just like negative evaluations of your own experience. PTSD, people who go to war a lot, you'll notice that they'll have PTSD. They have flashbacks, nightmares. They might wake up in the middle of the night and like drenched in sweat. and they'll like feel avoidance symptoms, they'll have negative cognitive symptoms, they'll just constantly be aroused because like just cortisol throughout their body is firing off all the time. Dissociative disorders is like dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, dissociative identity disorder, depersonalization, derealization disorder. So these are all like not that high yield to know the differences, but it's just important to go through them one by one. So dissociative amnesia is just you can't recall past experiences. Dissociative fugue is the assumption of a new identity. Dissociative identity disorder is this idea that people have multiple personalities. And then depersonalization or derealization is the idea that you're feeling detached from your mind or your body or the environment. The thing is, these are like very common in TV shows and movies, like especially dissociative identity disorder. But in real life, you will see this very infrequently. Like even on the psych ward, you won't really see these things too much. And so that's why they're a little bit lower yield for your exam. Somatic symptom and related disorders. So somatic symptom disorder and illness anxiety disorder is very easy to get confused between, as well as conversion disorder. So these are all like things where your psychological state kind of affects your perception of things that are going on in your body. Somatic symptom disorder is this idea that you have like a lot of bodily symptoms, but you can't really explain it by like medical explanations of what's going on. So somebody has like a lot of coughing, a lot of joint pains, but there's no like all their lab work comes back normal, and everything is actually like medically, all the medical signs of them is that it's normal, but they're still having all these symptoms. You'll say they have somatic symptom disorder. Illness anxiety disorder is like if somebody is really concerned that they have like colorectal cancer and they like are constantly coming to the doctor and like asking for a colonoscopy and like x-ray and MRI and all these things, they'll have illness anxiety disorder. Conversion disorder is associated with prior trauma, and it's when somebody has like unexplained symptoms related to loss of bodily function. I remember I was in the opto clinic and a lot of people had conversion disorder about like different vision issues, and it was like things that were not explainable by examining their eye. Like their eye looked completely fine, but for some reason they would like not have vision out of their right eye or not have vision out of their left eye. And a lot of these people also had prior trauma, and so that was kind of like conversion disorder is kind of it's like this poorly understood idea, but it's that like the processing of the information is faulty for some reason, and because of that there's some unexplained symptom that's explaining the loss of some bodily function. Hypochondriasis is something that like a lot of med students have, or pre-meds, and it's like a lot of people who like read a lot of literature about different diseases and then they feel like, oh, I have this disease, despite not actually having the symptoms for that disease. That's like somebody who's a hypochondriac. Personality disorders can be described as cluster A, cluster B, cluster C. Cluster A is weird, so paranoid, schizotypal, schizoid. Cluster B is wild, so antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. And then cluster C is worried, avoidant, dependent, obsessive compulsive. You don't really need to know the differences between all of these. I would like, if you get a question on it, I would read about it in the explanation, but really I would know about cluster A is weird, cluster B is wild, cluster C is worried. I guess I can go through it quickly. So cluster A, paranoid is somebody who's like just paranoid about things. Schizotypal and schizoid, those are a little more confusing. Schizoid is usually just somebody who doesn't want to talk to people, is like happy to be alone, doesn't really enjoy social interactions. Schizotypal is like more somebody who's like more magical thinking, that might just be generally like a little bit on the weirder side. They might like think weird things about the world, like if there's 7 clouds in the air, then that means it's going to rain, something like that. Somebody who's cluster B is generally like, those are people who are like a little bit more like what you would classify as like crazier. When you would say that, that's kind of what cluster B, what you would be referring to. So antisocial is somebody who's just against social norms, like does like somebody who sets fire onto things. That's somebody who's antisocial. Borderline is somebody who's like constantly getting into relationships and then like would cause a lot of issues in that relationship, would have a lot of trouble being on their own, but then like constantly like break up and then start new relationships. They have a lot more symptoms related to those things. Histrionic, somebody who's like very dramatic, might be like crying over the smallest things. Narcissistic is somebody who's always thinking about themselves. Cluster C, worried, so somebody who's avoidant, tries to avoid all situations where they could get hurt. Somebody who's dependent, you know what dependent means, and then obsessive compulsive, we kind of talked about that already. It's important to know that this is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and what we talked about here is obsessive compulsive disorder. So usually obsessive compulsive disorder is more serious in people than obsessive compulsive personality disorder, but they obviously can be both very serious. Okay, now we have all right, so the next thing we'll talk about is understanding psych disorders. And so there's multiple different approaches that people take to understand things like schizophrenia and anxiety and depression and all the things that we just talked about. The first is a behaviorist approach, second is biomedical approach, and third is biopsychosocial approach. So behaviorist approach is kind of using that classical and operant conditioning that we were talking about before. It's a lot about, reward versus punishment and the classical conditioning that shapes the disorder that you're developing. Biomedical takes into account physical and medical causes, and so examples of this would be how people classify depression as lack of serotonin and schizophrenia as lack of dopamine, things like that. Biopsychosocial approach is combining all of those things, so biological, psychological, social components, and probably the right model is something that combines all the different aspects of why a disease is existing. Then we have the psychodynamic approach, and this is related to Freud's psychoanalysis. And then we have this DSM-5. And so in your psychiatry clerkship, you'll probably get a handout of the DSM-5, and that's basically something that you'll refer to all the time because it's so difficult in real life to distinguish between somebody who has OCD versus OCPD versus bipolar. It's very, very difficult, and so a lot of times you'll use the DSM-5 to actually you'll read through it and try to understand which one of these disorders does the person have. Now we have biological basis, and so this is the biological basis for all of these different disorders. The MCAT loves to test this, so does step 1, because it's really easy to ask questions about biological basis for different diseases. So schizophrenia is, people think it's because of genetic factors, it's because of marijuana use, it's because of family history, it's because of birth trauma. It's not entirely understood why schizophrenia happens, but it's probably a mix of all these things. Then depression is because of increased glucocorticoids, decreased norepinephrine, decreased serotonin. Decreased serotonin is kind of the big one that you want to know. That's part of the reason why you'll hear about SSRIs and SNRIs. They're basically things that increase the availability of norepinephrine and serotonin. And then also dopamine is down too. Bipolar disorder, usually you have increased norepinephrine, increased serotonin, and then this is also can be heritable. You might see that somebody whose mom has bipolar, they might also be a little more predisposed to that. Alzheimer's, you can see that there's genetic factors to that. There's brain atrophy. You'll see a lot of times on CT or MRI of the brain, you'll see atrophy. There's a lot of times decreased acetylcholine. And then beta amyloid plaques, that's something that a lot of time deposits in the brain as a result of Alzheimer's. Then we have Parkinson's. I always remember TRAP as the mnemonic of Parkinson's. You can search that up as the mnemonic to help you understand what Parkinson's looks like, but a lot of times people with Parkinson's, they'll have this pill rolling tremor, and it's a resting tremor. That's also important, so when they are moving, the tremor starts to go away. They also have bradykinesia, which means you'll see them a lot of times, they'll kind of be walking normally and then they're walking really slowly. That's bradykinesia. They'll have mask-like faces. They have cogwheel rigidity, and so if you are if you're in the emergency department or something and you think that the patient has Parkinson's, then one of the things that you'll do is you'll hold their hand and you'll move their hand like that, and you'll be testing for whether they have cogwheel rigidity. And somebody who has cogwheel rigidity, it'll kind of be that, where they're it's kind of hard. It's very easy to move their hand at some intervals, and then it kind of freezes. That's cogwheel rigidity. And then they have a shuffling gait. So when you can a lot of times ask them to walk, and you'll notice the shuffling gait, and that can help you with diagnosing Parkinson's. Okay, next we have all of these. This is actually I think it's pretty intuitive, a lot of these concepts, and so we're going to go through them quickly, and I'll give you examples to try to help you understand them as we go. So the first thing is social facilitation. This is the tendency of people to perform at different levels when others are around. So if you're around really, really smart people and they're working really hard, you might be kind of performing at that level, versus if you're with people who are doing drugs and drinking all the time, then you might be more predisposed to that type of behavior. De-individualization is the idea that you lose self-awareness in large groups. So examples of this is actually bystander effect is a perfect example of this, where in a group you're less likely to respond to somebody in need. So if there's car accident and there's like hundreds of people who are all just like kind of walking by and they ignore the car accident. That's an example of bystander effect, where everybody thinks like they have less responsibility in the situation because there's so many people around, and so the probability that somebody intervenes actually decreases when there's more people in the group. Peer pressure is when, you know what peer pressure is. It's when somebody like puts pressure on you to do something. Usually those people are your peers or your equals. Social loafing is the idea that somebody doesn't pull his or her weight in a group setting. And so an example of this is like when you get to med school, a lot of times something you'll have to do is evaluate your peers in group settings, and everybody really hates this because in the evaluation forms it'll say like, what did your like teammates not do so well? Give them like feedback for improvement. And a lot of people feel like this is the first time in their lives where like nobody is social loafing in their groups, like everybody's pulling their own weight, and that's kind of the first time that that's happened in their lives. And then you're still forced to give negative feedback, and so that's why that's like something interesting that people comment on. Polarization is the idea that the tendency for decisions in a group to be more extreme. And so like a lot of times you'll have like one person who's like a little bit more extreme than the rest of them. And so like polarization is just the idea that like in a group there'll be more extreme decisions. Groupthink is the idea that, you know what groupthink is, again, it's like the idea that you're less likely to consider outside ideas. Like once the group starts to think something, people are going to be less likely to propose alternate ideas because they want to sync with the group. Culture, you know what cultures are: beliefs, ideas, behaviors, actions, characteristics of a group or society. You know what assimilation is. It's the idea that like an immigrant or a migrant or a minority comes into this culture and they start to assimilate with the mainstream culture. They'll like listen to the music, they'll absorb like the specific vernacular, they'll absorb like maybe like different rituals, different beliefs, all those things. Multiculturalism is the idea that we can have multiple cultures in a single society, and then subcultures is the idea that there's this primary culture in the community, and then there can also be smaller subcultures that are a little bit different from that primary culture. Okay, the next thing is attitudes and behaviors. Again, you know all of these things, so we're just going to go quickly through these things, and I'll just give you examples to remember them. Attitudes is the tendency towards expression of positive or negative feelings or evaluations of something. So if somebody asks you what's your attitude towards this teacher, what's your attitude towards like what you think about pre-med classes, that's like asking you what's your expression of positive or negative feelings towards something. It can be affective, it can be behavioral, or it could be cognitive. Cognitive is what you think, behavioral is how you act, affective is how you feel about something. Functional attitudes theory is basically the idea that there's 4 functional areas of attitudes. There's knowledge, ego, expression, adaptability, and ego defense. I never actually got a question on functional attitudes theory, so I would just read up on it if you're really curious, but don't worry about it too much. Learning theory is the idea that attitudes are developed through forms of learning: direct contact, direct interaction, direct instruction, and conditioning. So this is just the idea that you learn through a series of different things. Like you have to become in primary contact with that information, you have to have interaction with that information, you have to have instruction about it, you have to be conditioned. Elaboration likelihood model is the idea that attitudes are formed and changed through different routes of information processing based on the degree of elaboration. So there's central route processing and peripheral route processing. So this is the idea behind elaboration likelihood model. Very simply, it's the idea that there's a central route that involves higher elaboration, like you're seriously thinking about something, versus peripheral route where you're not really thinking about something, like how many stairs are on your staircase. You don't really think about that, and so it goes through the peripheral route, versus like should you give this patient like IV insulin and fluids, versus like should you give them oral anti-hypoglycemics, and you're talking about this with your entire medical team. That's going to be more of a central route thing. Next is social cognitive theory. This is the idea that attitudes are formed through watching others, personal factors, and the environment. So you form your attitude through those series of factors, and you can change your behavior or attitude based on observation. So if you feel like everybody around you has this political opinion and they act based on that political opinion, you might change your behavior, your attitude based on the observation of people around you. Then you have socialization. Socialization is the process of internalizing social norms and values expected in one society. So once you join a different like community or society, a lot of times you'll be socialized into thinking the way that they do, and into adopting the norms and values that they have. Sanctions can be positive or negative. This can be like a reward for certain behaviors or a punishment for certain behaviors. Formal are official rewards and punishments. Informal is a sanction that's not enforced or punished by authorities, but occurs in everyday interactions with others. So asking somebody to lower their volume or their voice in a movie theater, that's an example of informal sanction. Like the law like the government doesn't actually enforce that, but other people enforce that. Like if you're very loud in the movie theater, people are going to like look at you meanly, or they're going to, say something. Norms it just determines the boundaries of acceptable behavior within a society. Mores is basically informal norms with major importance for society, and if broken, it can result in severe sanctions. So, an example of this is drug abuse is not socially acceptable. Mores are more about right or wrong, versus folkways, which are informal norms that are less significant. So, holding a door open for somebody, that could be like right or rude versus right or wrong, So, mores is like a lot more serious thing. So, it's something that has very severe sanctions. It's something where, like, if it's broken, then like people will feel that you've done something morally wrong. Versus folkways is more about things that people feel like if you have violated, then it's more about being rude rather than like being wrong. So another example of a folkway is if like somebody says hello to you while passing by you and you like just give them a frown or something. That's like technically not morally wrong, but it's kind of rude. Then we have taboos. Taboos is something considered unacceptable by almost every culture. So like cannibalism, incest. Stigma is the extreme disapproval or dislike of a person or group based on perceived differences from the rest of society. And so tons of stigma. People say like that we should get rid of stigma, and that we should like expose people to different groups of people so that they have less stigma toward those groups of people. Deviance is the violation of norms, rules, or expectations in a society. And differential association theory is the idea that deviance can be learned through our interactions with others. And so this basically says that people commit crimes because of their associations with other people. Nobody like learns deviance, but unless they actually interact with other people who are teaching them deviant behavior. Conformity is the idea that we change beliefs or behaviors in order to fit with groups or society. You know what conformity is? It's kind of like if you were like people. There's this really interesting study, or I guess fact. I don't know where I heard it first, but it's the idea that like if you look backwards in an elevator where everybody's looking forward, then everybody's heart rate starts to go up a little bit, and that's the idea that you're like not conforming and people feel like there's something off. Compliance is the idea that people change their behaviors based on the request of others. So if you like feel like your neighbor has really tall lawn and your grass is like very well, or everybody else in the neighborhood keeps their grass very short, then and the neighbors like, or the HOA or whatever asks that person to cut their lawn, that's an example of compliance when they do. Obedience is the idea that there's an authority figure who's actually enforcing something, and then you change your behavior in accordance with that authority figure. And so I guess a better example is if your neighbor told you, then it would be compliance because you're agreeing and you're cutting your lawn, versus obedience would be like if the HOA threatens to fine you or something, unless you cut your lawn, then that's more obedience. Okay, next we have elements of social interaction. Again, you know all these things, so I think it's more helpful for me to tell you stories and examples of things rather than me just reading straight from the text, because I think you'll learn a lot more. So status, it's like position in society used to classify individuals. I think in medicine, status is a really big thing, especially like everybody in the hospital has a badge that says like what they do, what's their role. And so it helps you to classify individuals into like what's their role in society or in the hospital. Ascribed status is the idea that we involuntarily assign people to a specific status based on their race, based on their gender, based on their ethnicity, based on something that like they didn't give themselves. Achieved status is something that they've achieved through merit. Master status is the idea that the status by which an individual is primarily identified. So your master status is usually, if you ask somebody to introduce themselves, they'll introduce themselves as like their master status, which is usually like their job or their education or what degree they're pursuing or something like that. The role is the set of beliefs, values, or norms that define the expectations of certain status in a social situation. So your role could be like mother, it could be son, it could be doctor, it could be student, depending on the specific social situation or specific circumstances that you're in. Role performance is the idea that you're carrying out the behaviors of your given role. And so if your role is a mom, then your role performance is the idea that you're performing out the like actions that a mother would do. Role partner is another individual who helps define a specific role in this relationship. And so relationships, by definition, you have more than one person. And so the role partner is helping you to establish your role as well. And so you can't be like a mom unless you have a child, right? And so in that relationship, the role partner is the child. Role set is the set of all roles that are associated with a status. And then role conflict is the difficulty managing multiple roles. I always think about Spider-Man when I think about role conflict, because like the entire comic of Spider-Man is about how he's having trouble like managing multiple roles in his life. And then role strain is the difficulty managing just one role. So I guess, yeah, Spider-Man applies to both of these. Groups is the idea that there are two or more people with similar characteristics that share a sense of unity. By definition, like your class in your college is probably like a group. Your friend, you call that a friend group. Those are people who have similar characteristics that share a sense of unity. Peer groups is a self-selected group based on shared interests. So if you like guitar and you join a guitar class and you hang out with those people outside of class and you like try to play guitar together, that's a peer group. Family group is the group to which you're born, adopted, married. That's like your family, basically. Kinship is it can be like a filial kinship, which is the people who you're related to by choice, or consangual kinship, which is related by blood. And so marriage is the biggest example of affinal kinship, and consanguineous kinship is relation through blood. In-group is the group that you're in. Out-group is the one that you compete or oppose to. I'm forgetting the book, but I'll remember it later, about like in-groups and out-groups, and like the whole book became really famous because it was like two different gangs that were against each other. Reference group is the group that you compare yourself to. Sorry, I just wanted to point out that this was the book/movie. I was thinking about The Outsiders. If you've ever watched the movie, the whole movie is kind of this idea that there's this in-group and the out-group, and the two groups are always fighting against each other. Okay, back to the document. Reference group is the groups that you compare yourself to, and primary group is the one that you contain strong emotional bonds to. So it could be your family that your primary group is, or it could be your friend group, or it could be something completely different. Secondary group is like often temporary. It's kind of like weaker bonds. And then I don't know how to pronounce this, but I think it's Gemeinschaft. It basically means your community, and Gesellschaft basically means your society. Groupthink we've already talked about. Network is the observable pattern of social relationships between individuals or groups. Organization is this idea that a group with identifiable membership that engages in a certain action to achieve a common purpose. And so I often think about like the Democratic Party or Republican Party as an organization. They all have this common purpose, which is to advance their political interest. And they have this identifiable membership, and they engage in that certain action, which is to vote for a certain president or to vote for particular leaders to achieve that common purpose. Bureaucracy is this rational system of administration, discipline, and control. It basically has these 6 defining characteristics, which we'll talk about later. But I think it's helpful. Like I always, before I was studying for the MCAT, or maybe a little bit before that, I always thought about bureaucracy as like this terrible thing. But basically it's this idea that we have like tons of things to do, and we have tons of people who want to do those things. And so bureaucracy is how we organize ourselves in order to achieve administration, achieve discipline, and achieve control. And then we have all the negative qualities of bureaucracy, which is that can be inefficient, it can be, it can have red tape, all those things. Iron law of oligarchy is this idea that the democratic and bureaucratic systems naturally shift to being ruled by an elite group. And so this is the idea that, in a democracy, everybody theoretically has the right to make decisions about our like policy and about our economy and all those things. But then this idea is that naturally it's going to shift to the elite group, because the elite group has more influence, they have more spending power, they're obviously more likely to vote than people who don't have driver's license or don't have, houses, things like that. A sect is a religious group that arose from a split from a larger religion. So I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples of sects. And so that's basically the idea that there was previously a larger religion, a specific group of people had like slight changes in their beliefs, and so they segued away from that larger religion. Now we have Weber's ideal bureaucracy, and so they have 6 characteristics of a bureaucracy that basically all bureaucracies have to have in order to be defined as a bureaucracy. I'm going to go with the easiest ones to remember first. Division of labor is very easy to remember. It's basically the idea that jobs are very well broken down. You know what you have to do. It's very well defined. Authority hierarchy is also kind of easy to understand. It's the idea that, there are people who are above you and below you, and there's a clear chain of command. If you don't know what people are supposed to do, that's not division of labor. And if you don't know who's above you and who's supposed to give you instructions, there's no authority hierarchy. Formal selection is the idea that there's merit to the job selection. There's technical qualifications, and so somebody who got a position has to be qualified for that. Formal rules and regulations is this idea that there's actual ways, specific ways that things are supposed to be done. People are not just doing whatever they want. And then I think career orientation is slightly easier to understand, which is the idea that people are career professionals. They don't own units that they manage, and so they're working within this hierarchy and working with the system. And then finally there's impersonality, and so basically this means that people should be cogs in the machine almost, and that they should understand the rules and the controls, and that they should apply it based on that. They shouldn't be using their specific personalities in order to make decisions or in order to change the system. Alright, I hope you're doing good and powering through it, because I am too. So next we have self-preservation and interacting with others. Basic model of expressing emotions is basically the idea that there's universal emotions and expressions that can be understood across cultures. When I was studying for the MCAT and this topic came up, I always used to think about this image from the Harvard Business Review, and they talked about these 6 faces that everybody knows across all the different cultures, which is this person's surprised, this person's angry, this person is scared, this person has anger, contempt, this person's happy, and this person's disgusted. And the idea is that these are 6 emotions that you can read on anybody, no matter what culture they're coming from, no matter how their culture specifically expresses emotions, things like that. Then we have social construction model of expressing emotion, which is the idea that emotions are solely based on the situational context of those social interactions. Display rules is the idea that there's unspoken rules that govern the expression of emotions. And then impression management is the idea that you maintain your public image, which can be accomplished through flattery, boasting, managing appearances, ingratiation, aligning actions, alter casting. When you start med school, you'll realize that a lot of, or even residency, I can only speak about med school, but a lot of, clerkships is impression management, is making sure that people not only see that you're doing a good job, but also you're working to be a good person and manage impressions. Dramaturgical approach is the idea that people create images of themselves in the same way that actors perform a role in front of the audience. There's the front stage and the backstage. Front stage is where you're seen by an audience, and backstage is when you're not in front of an audience. And so this approach basically says that people are different when they're around other people, and then people are different when they're alone at their home. Next is verbal communication. This is a communication through spoken, written, signed words. Nonverbal communication is the idea that we communicate through body language, through gestures, through all these things. And so when you're talking with patients in med school and beyond, a lot of communication that people ask you to be aware of is how your nonverbal communications are. How are you using your hands? How are you are you sitting next to the patient when you're delivering bad news? Are you standing over them? Things like that. Animal communication is the idea that there's not just communication between humans, but there's also communication between humans and other animals. Animals also use body language, they use facial expressions, they use visual displays, they use sense, they use vocalizations, they have tons of different ways of communicating. All right, next we have social thinking. This is really, really interesting. I used to love this specific page when I was studying. So we have interpersonal attraction, we have aggression, we have attachment. So these are all basically different ways that people interact with each other, I'll say. So interpersonal attraction is the idea that there's something that makes people attracted to each other or liking each other. It can be physical attractiveness, it can be how similar are your thoughts with the person that you like. Physical traits, it can be the idea that you've disclosed a lot about yourself that makes you people like you. Reciprocity, if you give somebody a gift or if you buy somebody coffee, they'll also give something back to you. And proximity, how close are you to the person that you like? So all of these things affect interpersonal attraction. Then we have aggression, which is the idea that we want to cause harm or social dominance. This can be physical behavior, verbal behavior, nonverbal behavior, and they have to have the intent to cause harm or to just demonstrate social dominance and increase social dominance. Attachment is the idea that you have an emotional bond to another person. Usually attachment refers to child and caregiver. Secure attachment is usually when you have a consistent caregiver, when the child needs compassion or when the child needs like caregiving, the caregiver is there to provide care. And so if a child has secure attachment with their mom or their dad, then that means that they also have a strong preference towards their mom and dad compared to strangers. Avoidant attachment is when there's very little response to a distressed child. So the child is, fallen or is crying or is hurt, and nobody is like paying attention to that child. And so in this case, it kind of makes sense that the child has no preference to whether the caregiver is there, to whether strangers are there. Then ambivalent attachment is when there's an inconsistent response to child's distress. Like child is crying, or child has like a lot of pain, or child has fallen, and then sometimes the caregiver is neglectful. And so then the child can become distressed when the caregiver leaves and is ambivalent when the caregiver returns, because sometimes the caregiver can be helpful, and so then it's distressed when the caregiver leaves, but then sometimes the caregiver is not helpful, and so it doesn't really, it's kind of ambivalent when the caregiver returns. Then we have disorganized attachment, which is that the caregiver is actually actively harming the child, can be erratic, abusive, and there's no clear pattern in response to the caregiver's absence or presence. If you ever read like therapy books, a lot of therapy books love to go into like all these different forms of attachment, and a lot of times how it affects the child's future development. Social support is the idea that one is cared for by their social network, their friends, their families, their teachers, all those things. Emotional support is listening to somebody, giving them empathy, affirming them, all those things. Esteem support is affirming the qualities and skills of a person. If you've ever had like a mentor or even a friend, but usually mentors, I always feel like the best mentors are people who balance like criticism or balance constructive criticism with esteem support. And I personally always feel like esteem support is way more valuable in somebody's like professional and personal development than constructive criticism. I know everybody's always about like giving constructive criticism to somebody to help them improve, but I always think that even if somebody has ways to improve, I think just giving them esteem support, telling them that like the fact that they're trying towards their personal and professional goal is always way more helpful, and affirming their like hard work is always way more helpful than giving them constructive criticism. Obviously both are valuable. Material support is providing physical support or monetary support. Informational support is giving useful information to somebody. Network support is providing a sense of belonging to a person. Foraging is searching for, exploiting food resources. Foxes, bears, all of those things forage. Mating system is how groups organize in a way to engage in sexual behavior. Monogamy is exclusive mating relationships. Polygamy is when you have multiple relationships with members of the opposite sex. I think it can also be same sex. I'm not sure about that. And then there's polyandry and polygyny, which is males with multiple females versus polyandry, females with multiple males. Promiscuity is no exclusivity. And then mate choice is the selection of a mate based on attraction and traits. Why do specific birds choose other birds? That's like mate choice. Altruism is when somebody helps somebody else with no benefit to him or herself. Game theory is attempting to explain decision making between individuals as if they're participating in a game. So when I was showing you the example of the prisoner's dilemma, that's an example of game theory. Inclusive fitness is the idea that that an organism's success in the population is based on how well it propagates its own genes, and inclusive fitness also includes the ability of offspring then to support others. So inclusive fitness is basically this theory that was developed to kind of explain why do animals engage in these types of behaviors, which is like, why does a honeybee attack an intruder when it knows it's going to die, but it's defending its colony? It's because part of the reason is because there's like these related individuals in the colony, and these related individuals have some of the same genes or same phenotypes or same genes, I guess, as the honeybee. And so it thinks that like the best chance of passing down its genes is actually to do this behavior, which is attacking the intruder and defending the colony. Then something like kin-selected altruism, like why do individuals show altruism when like it's risking the chance that their genes are going to propagate? And the reason is that it's like the cost of decreasing its own offspring output is outweighed by enhancing the offspring output of like maybe its brother and sister, and so ultimately the genes are still going to be passed on, and more of it is going to be passed on through alternate methods. Next, we have social perception. This is the way that we generate perceptions and impressions about other people in our social environment. There's social capital, which is the idea that we can develop and maintain relationships from our social networks that are willing to help each other. So a lot of what you'll do in your professional life is building social capital, not just actual capital, not just like money, but you'll also be developing relationships, and you can call other people in your network, and that's considered social capital. Implicit personality theory is that when we look at somebody for the first time, we pick up on one of those characteristics, and then we assume other characteristics or other traits about that person based on that first characteristic that we pulled up. So if I look at somebody and the first thing I think is that they're really hardworking, I might assume a lot of other traits about that person because I saw them work really hard in just that one instance that I saw them. Cognitive biases include primacy effect, recency effect, reliance on central traits, halo effect, just world hypothesis, self-serving bias, and we'll talk about all of these. So if I give you a list of numbers and I give you like 50 numbers, you're probably going to remember the first few numbers that I told you and the last few numbers I told you. That's referred to as primacy effect and recency effect. Primacy is you remember the first few numbers I told you, and recency is you remember what I told you most recently. Reliance on central traits is the idea that you use a person's key fundamental personality trait in order to create an entire impression of what that person is like. And so if somebody is like smiling at me and really friendly on my first day at some new team, then that's like my central trait, which is that they're very kind. And then I assume a lot of other things, like they're going to help me with like printing out my papers, or they're going to be nice to me when I ask them a question, and they're going to be like dependable if I ever have an emergency, things like that. So that's an example of reliance on central trait. I feel like people on TikTok love to talk about halo effect versus horn effect. Halo effect is kind of the idea that you use a single characteristic to create all these other positive characteristics about somebody. It's usually about how attractive they are. So if somebody's really attractive, then you'll kind of also think that they're intelligent, kind, rich. And if somebody is like very mean or they're not as charismatic, then you might think that they're like not intelligent, not kind, not rich. And so an example of a halo effect that you'll see a lot is people who are celebrity doctors who are very attractive and charismatic. You might trust their advice more than like somebody who's very like rude or not as charismatic. Just world hypothesis is this idea that we like to consider the world as a just and honest place. And so if something bad happens to somebody, then we have a tendency, a cognitive bias, to think that they deserved it. And that's like the just world hypothesis. And then self-serving bias is the idea that we like to think of things as happening in a way that self-serve us. And so if somebody does way better than us on an exam, then we'll think like, oh, that's because I didn't study that, or like, I guess that's because that person got lucky. But if that person did really poorly on the exam as compared to us, then we'll think like that person is not at all hardworking, like I'm a much more hardworking person than that person. And so that's the self-serving bias. So it's important to know what cognitive biases exist so that you're able to like actively counteract that bias. And so if you know that internally there's this bias that makes you think that the world is a just place, then you have to actively counteract that by thinking like, oh no, like I'm inclined to think that that person deserved the bad thing that happened to them, but that is not true. That's like how I think about cognitive biases. Then we have attribution theory. That's the idea that we focus on tendency of individuals to infer the causes for other people's behavior. That's kind of what I was talking about with the self-serving bias. Dispositional is internal. The causes of behavior are internal, and situational are external, which means that situations or context create behavior. And so I always think it's better to have like this dispositional belief, which is that the causes of my behavior are because I chose to have it. And that allows you to have more control about the behavior. Obviously that's very difficult, and so it's a lot of times like you'll feel a lot of times it's easier to think that things are situational and that the behaviors that you have is because of the circumstances that you are around. All right, next let's talk about correspondence correspondent inference theory. This is the idea that we focus on the intentionality of the person's behavior. So when someone unexpectedly does something that either helps us or hurt us, we form a dispositional attribution. We correlate that action with the person's personality. And so basically, what was the person's intention? And so based on that person's intention, we correlate that to their personality. Fundamental attribution error is the bias towards making dispositional attributions rather than situational attributions in regards to the actions of others. So an example of this is, let's say that somebody does poorly on their exam. I might have the bias to making that failure as a result, thinking that's a result of their lack of studying, rather than thinking like some like family circumstance made them not have enough time to study. So that's basically like the fundamental attribution error. Attribution substitution is the idea that individuals must make judgments that are complex but instead substitute a simpler solution or a heuristic. So when you're making a very complex judgment, you might just make a simpler heuristic or a simpler judgment just to help you out with the attribution. So here's some helpful examples. One is the shopper might choose a product based on its color rather than the technical details like emissions or, like the texture, like more complicated things. And then somebody might judge their happiness based on how they feel about the love life rather than all the aspects of their happiness. And then for correspondence inference theory, which we talked about before, this is the idea that we infer that the person's behavior matches their personality when the behavior is intentional, freely chosen, has distinctive effects. And so if you see somebody who's being friendly, you might infer that they're a friendly person. That's basically correspondent inference theory. It might also be that their personality doesn't match their behavior. For example, if that behavior was forced or rewarded, like if somebody's rewarded for being friendly to you, then it's kind of harder to make that inference on them. And then the other thing we talked about was fundamental attribution theory. So an example of fundamental attribution error is if you criticize an employee for being late to a meeting, but then later you excuse yourself for being late, then that's the fundamental attribution error. That's the idea that like, oh, you're criticizing this person because you think that that's like on them, like that's because of their internal behavior, like they're just a lazy person or they don't care about showing on time. But then when you do it, you've made an excuse that like, oh, you were running late because there was traffic or something like this. That's the fundamental attribution error. Okay, and then there's actor-observer bias. This is the idea that you tend to attribute your own actions to external causes and others' actions to dispositional causes. This is just kind of more about the fundamental attribution error. Okay, next we have stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotypes are cognitive. They're like, basically you think about them. That's the attitude or impression is based on limited or superficial information. And so if I see like 3 people who look a certain way act a certain way, then I might form the stereotype that all people who look that way act that way. Self-fulfilling prophecy is when you have a stereotype that leads to an expectation, and then those expectations create conditions that lead to the confirmation of that stereotype. So this is really dangerous when you have people like teachers who form stereotypes of specific students, for example. That might result in them like acting a certain way to that specific stereotype of students. Like let's say that they think that that like 10% of the class, they've been told prior to the class starting that those specific people are underperformers. So they have the stereotype that like group of people are underperformers, and so throughout the year they might act in a way that they like neglect to teach those kids as much, or they treat them like they're not as smart. And so at the end of the class, those 10% of people might actually underperform as compared to everybody else because the teacher taught them differently or treated them differently, when there might not actually be a difference in their actual capacity. It's because there was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another example of self-fulfilling prophecies that's easier to understand is when you say like, I am bad at math. And so you constantly tell yourself like, I'm bad at math, I'm bad at math, I'm bad at math. And because you're constantly telling yourself that, you actually go to math exams and you underperform because either like A, you just told yourself that so many times that you didn't study, or B, like you felt like it was too hard even when you had the capacity to understand it. And so that's an example of self-fulfilling prophecy. Then there's stereotype threat. This is the idea that concern or anxiety about confirming a negative stereotype about one social group. So example of stereotype threat is like in those forms where it asks you like what's your gender, what's your race. Some studies have shown that like African American people who have had to fill out like what race they'll underperform just because of stereotype threat, or gender women might underperform on certain math tests just because of the stereotype threat of like the gender differences exist, even when there's no actual differences. It's just the fact that there's like this anxiety or stress that occurs because somebody may want to confirm or may feel the pressure to confirm a certain negative stereotype about their group. Or like age, sometimes when like older people they're forced to take a short-term memory test, you'll see this a lot in the hospital. When if you tell that person like, oh, you're like 85, we don't expect you to do too well, if you ever tell somebody that right before you take this memory test, they're going to perform pretty badly as compared to if you say like, oh, you're very young, like I'm pretty confident that you'll do well on this memory exam. So that's what stereotype threat is. It's a really interesting phenomenon. And so the best way to combat stereotype threat, if you're ever worried about it, is to constantly self-affirm yourself, to tell yourself like you're really good, you're doing a really good job, you're like, that negative stereotype doesn't exist, it's actually a positive stereotype, things like that. So self-affirmation is the best like I guess therapy for stereotype threat. Then you have prejudice. Prejudice is affective. It's an irrational positive or negative attitude towards a person, group, or thing prior to an actual experience. So if you have a prejudice against a certain race or minority or gender, that's an example of what I'm talking about. Ethnocentrism is the idea that you make judgments about other cultures based on your own values and your own beliefs within your own culture. And cultural relativism is the idea that we should recognize people's cultures and groups and decisions based on their own cultures and their own terms. So you can't judge another like cultures, I guess like their ways of acting, their beliefs, unless you like judge it within their own culture. That's cultural relativism. Then we have discrimination. This is a behavioral thing. That means that there's prejudicial attitudes that cause individuals of a certain group to be treated differently than others. So it's important to understand that there's stereotypes. Stereotypes are cognitives. That's like something that we think of. Then there's prejudice. Prejudice is how we feel towards something. And then there's discrimination, which is how we behave towards something. So if you feel something about a particular group of people, that's prejudice. If you think something about that particular group of people, that's a stereotype. And then if you act in a way to treat them differently or to undermine them, that's discrimination. Okay. All right, let's talk about sociology, theories, and institutions. Functionalism is this really interesting idea that each part of our society has a function. These functions can be manifest or latent. So deliberate actions that serve to help a given system, those are manifest functions. Latent is the unexpected, unintended consequences of manifest actions. So let's say a functionalist is talking to you about schools. They would say that the manifest function of schools is to teach everybody and to educate you and to develop skills so that everybody can become productive members of our society. The latent function of a school might be like the fact that we're keeping kids out of school, that keeps them off the streets and keeps them from doing drugs, or it serves as like daycare so that parents are able to go to work. Conflict theory is based on Karl Marx, the guy behind communist ideas, and it basically understands how power differentials are created and contribute when you have multiple groups that are competing for resources to attain power and superiority. Conflict sociology is a study of the way that distinct groups compete for those resources. So these are very intertwined ideas, conflict theory and conflict sociology. Symbolic interactionism is all about symbols. So it's studying the way that people interact through a shared understanding of words, gestures, and symbols. And basically it's saying that there's meaning behind social symbols. So even the words that we use to communicate with each other, those are symbols of something else. And so symbolic interactionism, if they give you that as an answer choice, usually what they're asking about is like how do people understand different symbols between each other, and this can be words or it can be like nonverbal gestures, all those sorts of things. Micro sociology, that should make sense. It's all about the like, instead of like macro sociology, all about the society, it's about the individual components of the society, like individual communication. Social constructionism is the idea that individuals and groups make decisions to agree within a social reality, and the value that they place on certain things is what creates these social constructs. And so you can alter that constructed view by changing the values of the society. Rational choice theory is basically the idea that individuals will make decisions that maximize benefit and minimize harm. And so this is kind of a lot about where when you get to like prisoner's dilemma and all those things, a lot of that is about rational choice theory. Expectancy theory applies the rational choice theory within groups. Feminist theory is understanding how one's gender can be subordinated. And usually it's how females are subordinated. And then social institutions is basically well-established social structures that dictate certain patterns of behavior or relationships. If you think about like the Immigration Bureau, that's an example of a social institution. 4 tenets of medicine, this comes up all the time for like med school interviews, and when you start medicine, you'll see all of these tenets all the time. That is beneficence, which is doing good to others, non-maleficence, which is not doing harm to your patients, respect for autonomy, so allowing your patients to make their own choices, and justice, which is how do you choose to distribute limited resources within the medical system. Culture is how people choose to live their lifestyle within a group. Material culture is, the idea that people use physical objects, resources, and spaces to understand their culture. Symbolic culture is the way that symbols are used within the culture. Cultural lag is the idea that material culture can change much more quickly than symbolic culture. And so if you have ever thought about like countries that have found oil, or just countries that have gone from poor to rich really quickly, or rich to poor very quickly, you can understand that the material culture might change very quickly within that society, but the symbolic culture might not change as fast. Language is the spoken and written symbols that make sense. Value is what people determine as important in their life. Beliefs is what people consider to be true. So like religious beliefs, that's like what people consider to be true within their religion. Rituals is different ceremonial behaviors. And norms is the societal rules that define the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Okay. This is like I think pretty easy stuff. You probably know most of these things, so we'll go through it quickly. Demographics, those are like all the things that they make you check before you take an exam. Age, like statistics of the population. Fertility rate, that's like how many children are born to a woman over the lifetime in a population. Birth and mortality rate, Migration, you also know. Ethnic migrants, ethnic people who are moving, and then ethnic people who are emigrating to more industrialized countries, they tend to have increased fertility and increased mortality compared to the industrialized nation's population. Maybe because they're coming in with different like immune systems, different like ability to react to the environment that they're going into. Demographic transition is the model that represents a drop in birth rates and death rates as a result of industrialization. So you can imagine that if the country is becoming richer and is able to create, vaccines and clothes and food, then people are going to not die as much, and then they might not give as many births as many as they used to. Social movements is the idea that we can promote or resist social change. So there were tons of social movements, for example, during COVID. Globalization is the idea that we're creating a global economy with trade, and we have foreign labor markets. And then urbanization is the idea that you can process dense areas of population, creating a pull for migration. Okay. Finally, we have social class, social stratification, and epidemiology. So also all things that you probably know already. So social stratification, how do you rank categories of people into a hierarchy? Functionalism, we already talked about. It says that social stratification is necessary and results in the need of those who have special intelligence, knowledge, and skills to be in the most important professions or occupations. It's a harmonious equilibrium. I would kind of remove this most important. I think how functionalism understands social stratification is the idea that like everybody must play a role within our society, and so people who want to go through the training of like doctors and lawyers would be valuable for those professions and occupations, and people who choose to do other things would be valuable in those other things. Socioeconomic status is ascribed status versus achieved status. Achieved status is all about meritocracy. Ascribed status is what people give you based on like age, gender, your family name, all those things. Social class is a category of people with shared socioeconomic characteristics. So like what social class are you part of? That's a question that you'll see in TV and shows and movies. Prestige, you know what prestige is. Power, the capacity to influence people. So like if you have the power to like stand up and everybody has to bow down to you, then you have a lot of power because you can influence people. Enemy is the lack of social norms. It's kind of like when you break down social bonds between individual and society, and that's kind of what leads to anarchy. Strain theory is how anemic conditions can lead to deviance and then in turn reinforce social stratification. So you see a lot of this in like the 1900s in like Europe and Asia, and I won't go into all the history, but that's like a major thing that applies to those countries. Social capital is benefits provided by a social network. So if you go to like professional, if you go to like Harvard Business School or something, a lot of people say that you're going for the social capital. You get a lot out of those social networks. Maybe not as much in the education as you do in the social capital. I don't know. I didn't go to Harvard Business School, but that's what people say. Meritocracy is the idea that you can advance over the social ladder based on your intelligence and your achievements and your hard work. Social mobility is the idea that you can go through and go to higher level employment by working hard, reaching your credentials, and getting experience. Poverty is the idea that there's like well, you know what poverty is, but in the US we have this minimum poverty line that's based on the minimum wage, and then you have absolute and relative. So absolute is like absolute poverty is you can't like afford any resources that you need for your basic life necessities. So like if you don't have shelter, if you don't have food, all those things. Relative is when you're poorer than somebody else in comparison. So like if you earn like 30% less than somebody else, that's relative poverty. And it's not a hard number value. Relative deprivation theory is the idea that people want to get things that they believe they should have to. And that doesn't necessarily make them poor, but they may perceive that they're lacking resources and money, and it's all relative. You see relative deprivation theory all the time when people are making like specialty decisions in med school. Is like a lot of people go in like a lot of my friends wanted to go into like all the like super competitive surgery fields because kind of like a lot of people feel like they should go into it because they feel like they have to. Social reproduction is the idea that you can pass on social inequity, you can pass on poverty, you can pass on like the thoughts and the feeling of being inadequate through generations. Social exclusion is the idea that there's powerlessness that people feel when they're alienated from society. If you've ever like not been invited to a party, you kind of know what social exclusion feels like. Spatial inequality is the idea that there's social stratification across territories. There was this really interesting study that was published in one of the cities that I've lived in throughout my life, and it showed that like within different zip codes, the squirrels had speciated, like they had formed different species because there was like such a huge remarkable difference in the number of parks and number of like free land that was available in those two zip codes. And so that's kind of an example of spatial inequality, that just like within one zip code there was such a huge difference in climates and territories and all those things. Globalization we've talked about. I guess it's important to know that globalization has led to cheaper labor markets because there's more people available to do the same work. Epidemiology and disparities. So epidemiology and disparities, incidence. I think it's really important to know the difference between these two. Incidence is the number of new cases of a disease per population at risk, and prevalence is the number of cases of a disease per population. So if I told you that there are 500 cases of ALS this month, then like 500 new cases of ALS this month, that would be the incidence. And if I told you that there's 1,000 people with ALS this month, that would be prevalence. Mortality is the deaths caused by a given disease. So like examples of diseases that have high mortality is like Ebola virus, for example. Ethnic migrants, we've talked about already. Morbidity is the burden or degree of illness associated with a given death. Affordable Care Act is the attempt to increase healthcare coverage rates and reduce the cost of healthcare. So you want Affordable Care Act is about giving more people healthcare. Medicare and Medicaid is very easy to get confused. I always remember E for elderly, D for destitute or poverty. So E for elderly covers people who are 65 or older, people with ESRD and stage renal disease, and people with ALS. And then Medicaid is all the people who have significant financial need. And if you're like below a certain margin, then you'll get qualified for Medicaid. Okay. That's everything in Psych Soc. So I thank you so much for watching. If you've watched this far, then I'd appreciate hitting the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya.